since we're at 7:01, I think let's get things started. Good evening, everybody. Good night. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the Manhattan DA Candidates Forum, hosted by the Asian American Bar Association of New York. My name is Tai Chen, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. We're very excited to welcome an exciting lineup of candidates, of course, starting with candidate Diana Florence. Before we begin, though, I'd like to pass over the virtual microphone to Executive Director Yang Chen, who's the Executive Director of Albany, who will introduce our organization. Yang.
Thanks, Tai, and welcome, Diana. My name is Yang Chen. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Bar Association of New York, and we're called Albany for short. We are the largest diverse bar association in New York City and New York State, with currently about 1,500 paid members. And I believe that makes us also the largest diverse bar association in the country. And we are certainly the largest affiliate of NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, out of some 90 affiliates nationwide. And NAPABA has a reach of approximately 60,000 attorneys across the country. So it's a privilege for us to host you tonight, Diana, and we're looking forward to hearing your responses to some of our questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thanks, Yang. And so, Diana, just so that you are aware, and so that the audience members who were not with us last night are aware, we'll be speaking for about 30 minutes tonight, and I'll reserve a few minutes in the beginning and at the end for your introductory and concluding remarks. Otherwise, my colleagues on the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force will take turns asking questions, and then I'll field 1 or 2 questions, time permitting, from the audience. But yeah, we extend the warmest of welcomes to you. Thank you for participating in tonight's forum. We look forward to our conversation tonight. Would you like to take 1 or 2 minutes for brief introductory remarks?
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. So my name is Diana Florence, and of this race, there is no one with the deep experience as a prosecutor that I have. There are many interesting people in the race. They have interesting backgrounds, but I have spent my career for 25 years going after crimes of power. It started in 1995, when I took on major domestic violence cases and didn't do cases the same old way. I worked side by side with the victims and families to make sure that the cases truly looked like justice for the individuals and not what I thought it should be. From there, I spent the next 20 years prosecuting complex corruption cases, whether that meant people after 9/11 who falsified the existence of relatives in order to collect hundreds of thousands from the charities, or companies and executives who actually stole hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars from our public tax coffers by faking the strength of the concrete at the World Trade Center, Yankee Stadium, and other major New York City landmarks. Because of that case, I became the leader of a groundbreaking task force that focused on corruption and safety violations in the construction industry. And in that model that I created, it really was about not being reactive, not waiting for us to have the cases come across our desk, but leaving and understanding that immigrants and workers are not going to come to the district attorney's office, that it's incumbent upon us to leave our office and find the cases and make sure that those that have incorporated fraud into their business models are not rewarded, and that we need to level the playing field by not only making sure that we prosecute the 4 corners of the case, but also look to close loopholes, working side by side with legislators who can close those loopholes by co-authoring legislation. I've done that. The final phase of my career, though, was really working with immigrants. And that meant making sure that they were not subject to dangerous conditions at work. The case I'm perhaps most proud of involved the death of Carlos. He was a 22-year-old laborer, and one morning he went to work, he did everything he was supposed to, and by lunch he was buried alive. And that happened because the company and the developer on site cared more for the job and keeping the construction schedule than for Carlos's life. And Carlos and his 4 coworkers who worked in that unsafe condition were also victims of wage theft. And there was also millions of dollars in insurance fraud and tax fraud. I understand how to connect the dots, and I've done this work on behalf of regular New Yorkers. It's why I have the support of 20 more labor unions than anyone in this race. It's not because of who I know or political machine or connections. It's because I have proven time and time again that I will work my hardest for the people who need justice the most, everyday working people who don't have the connections, do not have access to a concierge system that lived under Cy Vance. When I am district attorney, I will make sure that everyone, no matter who you are, what you look like, or how much money you have, has access to justice and we can go to the district attorney's office and access us. Thank you so much. I'm looking for questions.
Thanks for the introductory remarks, Diana. It's great to learn a little bit more about your platform and where you stand on these issues. And we look forward to our conversation tonight. I'll pass over the virtual microphone to my colleague, Karen Yao, who will pose the first question. Karen is an Albany board member.
Hi, Diana. It is so good to have you join us this evening. As Tai Chi was saying, I am a board director for Albany. I'm also a civil rights lawyer. And my first question have to do with how you will be developing talent within your office. Asians constitute about 14% of New York City's population and more than 10% of Manhattanites. And yet Asian Americans constitute a lot fewer number of the ADAs in the Manhattan DA's office and almost none in the top leadership positions. So will you have Asian American DAs in the top leadership positions? And how will you ensure that?
Well, thank you for that question. And let me start by saying that the district attorney's office must reflect the community that they serve. And of course, one of the most ironic things about the Manhattan DA's office is our next door neighbors are Chinatown. And yet it is as if it is China. There is such a divide between the district attorney's office and Chinatown, and that must change. I will change that. My plan is to, first of all, of course, I want to diversify the ranks, but everyone that comes before you is going to say that. I guarantee no one's going to say, nope, I'm going to leave it all white and leave it the way it is. But I'm going to talk to you about how I'm going to do that. And what it is, it starts with going out into the community and being there, right? And even though I don't personally speak Chinese, I do speak Spanish, and that's something that helps me a lot. I'm going to make sure, though, that people go out into the community and see my face, and I'll learn Ni Hao Ma, and I'll learn Korean, and I'll learn the different dialects. And it's important for them to hear me speak some of the language, but more important to hear from the assistant district attorneys and see assistant district attorneys in the associations, at the libraries, in the neighborhoods, from when early on, to do two things. Number one, to listen to the community for things that are happening. But number two, to really mentor young kids who are going to see that it is possible to be a district attorney and work in the DA's office. And that has to be part of our mandate. So that's the first thing I'll do, making sure that we're in the community, and particularly in communities where Asian Americans live in Manhattan, particularly Chinatown, but of course not only Chinatown. Second, we need to be going and really engaging with those student bar associations at the different law schools. Those affinity groups are terrific, and they have terrific talent. But often, I think that for whatever reason, the district attorney's office is not something that appeals. Perhaps, it's not something that they think that they want to do. I think it's often about really breaking sort of those, barriers and seeing that we're approachable, that being a DA doesn't mean you're Sam Waterston on Law and Order, but you're actually a regular person. And for me, my own personal story is I became a district attorney, a prosecutor, because I saw what prosecutors can do, how quickly they could do justice while working as a public defender in law school. Didn't expect to do that. So I understand that it has to be, if we really want to diversify the ranks, and ultimately, yes, Karen, get people into the top echelon, it has to start with, attracting the best talent to want to come to us in the first place. Last thing I'll say is, I know for me, one of the greatest things about the Manhattan DA's office, because it's in the Manhattan DA's office, is there are incredibly talented lawyers there. And I learned some of my best tricks, right, from those lawyers. But I got lucky. I had some amazing mentors. We need to be much better about mentoring people and making sure that people see that mentees have mentors that look like them. So to me, it's about being conscious and wanting to attract people, whether they're Asian American, Hispanic, or African American.
Thank you. Well, more specifically, Manhattan DA's office, unlike Brooklyn and Queens, right now does not have an independent unit of ADAs and investigators whose work focus exclusively on hate crimes and hate-motivated incidents.
Mhm.
Will you? And how will you do it?
Absolutely. So my background is in complex investigation. So one of the frustrations I have personally as a Manhattanite is the way that the DA's office handles hate crimes, which is to be very reactionary and to be very tentative about what they charge and when they don't charge. For me, you know, one of the hallmarks of my career is pushing the envelope. It's not about overcharging, but it's saying, you know what? Just because the person says, that we don't have a case where they said, I'm going to punch you because you are an Asian person, doesn't mean we can't charge it as such. And doesn't mean you can also not charge it alongside the non-hate crime. But to me, we need to not hesitate. And that has two important reasons. Number one is we need to rebuild trust with the community, because I think that there has been, unnecessary hurdles and people aren't feeling protected. So that's number one. I won't be hesitant, and I will make sure that, we call hate crimes what we see. Number two, for me, yes, it will have an independent unit. But again, it won't just be waiting to watch for things on Twitter in order to prosecute. It's about using the investigative tools as well. There are organizations such as the Proud Boys who, spew racist hate and really are part of the problem. And we need to use our investigative power. This is not new, by the way. I didn't invent this. In the 1930s, the German Bund was prosecuted by the Manhattan DA's office. They were the American Nazi Party, and they went after their money. So I understand that if you cut off hate groups' funding, that can have reverberations in hate crimes that are more violent. So for me, it's twofold. Yes, it's going to be reacting and not hesitating when we charge, and it's also going to be looking at the finances of these organized hate organizations.
That's great. Diana, I want to just switch a little bit the direction because of something that you had mentioned. You talked about having neighborly relations with Manhattan's Chinatown. As you know, Mayor de Blasio has announced plans to close Rikers Island and instead replacing it with what he called borough-based or locally based jails. Do you support the building of a new skyscraper jail in Manhattan's Chinatown? And how will you ensure that low-income, elderly, Asian American immigrants of New York's Chinatown will not be disproportionately affected by it?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do not support building an out-of-scale building that will tower over the senior center that's right next door to the current Manhattan Corrections Center. What I believe is that we can renovate what's there. And I believe that we need to be looking and reinvesting that money into affordable housing. For me, I've spent a good amount of, I spent 25 years. I often think of Chinatown as my second home. I live in 28th Street on Kips Bay. So I've spent about equal time in both places. And for me, we need to preserve the character of Chinatown. And we also need to understand that there's also a lot of, decrepit infrastructure. I remember one afternoon in the fall, I was having lunch with one of the bid members who was showing me around, and we watched an older elderly woman try to get into her apartment with her groceries, and the stairs were in disrepair. We need to also be looking at those kinds of things as well. Are there landlords who are essentially endangering the elderly in Chinatown? It's not always about sending people to prison, but one of the amazing things about the district attorney's office is because we have have such power. The criminal law, as you all know, is the sharpest knife in the drawer. It allows us to use that leverage for change. And so for me, we want to make sure that if people are being victimized in Chinatown, especially by many of the developers who are coming, we have 2 bridges and we have a lot of loopholes. We want to make sure that the population that's there is able to live there and thrive and make sure that they're not being subject to unsafe conditions. So I think I maybe went a little astray from your borough-based jails, but if you want me to come back to that, I can.
Well, we might very well ask you to do that, but we also have many other questions to ask you. So I'm going to pass you back to my colleagues.
Sure.
Thanks so much, Karen. And thanks for the responses, Diana. I'm going to hand the virtual microphone over to Karen King, who is the chair of our Pro Bono and Community Service Committee here at Albany.
I always do that. Thanks, Diana, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. You spoke a bit about the power of the office and, neighborly relations and trust with the community. One of the matters that really has a long memory within the Asian American community is the prosecution of Abacus Bank during the financial crisis and what seemed to be a scapegoating of a small community bank servicing Chinatown while the big banks on Wall Street were sort of left to be. I guess question one is, were you involved in that prosecution? And, what are your thoughts about that? And number two, given the US-China political dynamic right now, how can we ensure that Chinese businesses and companies and people aren't targeted or treated unfairly given the political pressures?
Yes, and let me first say categorically, I was not involved in the Abacus Bank prosecution. What really struck me about that case, and it's interesting because one of the lead defense counsels on it was a friend of mine who also did a lot of construction cases. And I remember him telling me, well before the trial about the case, and I was astounded at what was, passing for a case. It seemed very flimsy at best. But what really struck me, and what I've always prided myself in is, look, I'm obviously not, I'm not Chinese, I'm not Latina, I'm not African American, but I've learned in my career about the different cultures, not by reading, but leaving my office and going out into the community. And anyone who understands, the different community, for example, in Chinatown, understands that, the mortgage fraud that the bank itself, they actually identified themselves, but the underlying sort of activity really related to the cultural sort of norms of how people did business and how they had cash and they were afraid to put things in banks. And if you understand a little bit more about how small businesses in the community work, you wouldn't have immediately gone to that this was a massive fraud. Secondly, I think that what was really terrible about that case was that, there was a real rush that we must go up when it was very clear that the fraud was, there was certainly lots of fraud there, but it was not at the bank level. It was at the bank manager level. It was that middle person. And the idea that that's an example of misusing the leverage of the district attorney's office to try to sort of get the bank to do something or pay money for a big headline. That is important to me. And I've always made sure that when I've used the awesome power of the district attorney, that we use it against companies that actually have done wrong and made sure that it's not the bad apples in between. But to answer your question, the second part of your question, we have to be really mindful about the power that we have, and we need to be sure that what we're doing when we use that prosecutorial power, we need to make sure that we're doing justice, and that's about balancing the prosecutions with actually the wrongdoing. So again, in the Abacus Bank, it was righteous to go after the guy who they ended up cooperating, but it was not righteous to go after the bank. And that is a nuance that you really need someone like me who has 25 years experience who understands the difference.
Really appreciate the answer. Thanks. Turn it back to you, Ty.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Diana. So Diana, we obviously want to address an important issue that's been impacting the Asian American community here in the city, and that's the upsurge and the instances of anti-Asian violence that has kind of plagued our community. And I have my colleague, Jen Luo, who is a member of the Issues Committee, who's going to ask a series of questions regarding this issue.
Of course, thank you.
Hi, Diana. It's a pleasure to meet you. So I heard you earlier mention the 1939 Nazi Party and the prosecution of that party. And as I think you're probably familiar, that prosecution actually did not use hate crime prosecution. That prosecution involved fraud, right? Embezzlement. So right now, a lot of the anti-Asian attacks are more individual one-offs. They're random attacks. They're not organized the way that the Nazi Party was. And so I'm curious, what is your approach to bring hate crime charges, or maybe not bring hate crime charges, but what is your approach to anti-Asian violence that are more happening on a random scale?
Yeah, so look, obviously you have to look at each individual, and you're right, though they weren't the Proud Boys in many of the cases we've been reading about, but they're no less serious that they're, obviously if you're the victim, it really doesn't matter whether it was from a syndicate or an individual. Really what I've noticed about many of the hate crimes that we've seen is the perpetrators of those suffer from mental illness. And what I've also noticed is that many of them have a series of open cases before they get to that hate crime. So it's an escalation. And that's a failure, frankly, of the system, that the fact that the hate crime even occurred should have been stopped by the very first act of violence, even if it was a low-level act of violence that was not a hate crime. So number one, for me, it's about making sure once and for all that we screen cases with mental health issues and work together with the public defenders, and also work with service providers to actually divert people to those. But I'll also tell you that one of my neighbors is a head of a unit at Bellevue for 30 plus years. And I've talked a lot about this sort of, this issue of hate crimes being perpetrated by people with mental health issues. And what he's told me, is that this is not a surprise. They know exactly who would have these types of issues. And if we had a connect the dots between Bellevue and the court system, we could actually start stopping these crimes before they happen. So for me, there is, of course, the issue of HIPAA privacy, but there are ways around that. Because we want to make sure ultimately people need to get the treatment they need, and we need to work together. So for me, it's partially prevention, and it's partially about making sure, once again, that we work with the community to also educate people about hate crimes as well.
Thank you. So just two more follow-up questions to your answer. One is, what do you mean by referring them to mental health services? What are the specifics of that, right? Because I think a lot of times the offenders are quite violent, and so I believe New York, Manhattan's mental health court does not accept violent offenders or violent felonies, so they would not be eligible for mental health court. And then if you're thinking about places like Kirby, right? Those are places that get you competent until you're competent for a trial. So those are not places that actually make you better. So what did you mean by that? And then the second question is, let's talk about the ones where the perpetrators don't have mental illness, right? They're just thinking about it as an opportunity. If they think, okay, the DA is not prosecuting this kind of crime, so I can just spit on an Asian person and walk away and get away with it, right? So what is your response to that type of crime?
Right. So let's start with the mental health. Right. So of course, as we all know as lawyers, right, there's not guilty by reason of insanity. That's one thing. That's one pile. The other pile is, are you competent to stand trial? That's yet another, and then there's people that are both competent to stand trial and would not be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Right. So that it's the third group that we want to talk about. So for me, I'm very familiar with a program called The Bridge, and they have something called ACT teams, where they can actually monitor and give supportive services to people to make sure that they're on their meds, that they get their treatment. To me, it's about partnering with something like The Bridge. And I know from working with them that it's shockingly not all that expensive to fund an ACT team. It's about $68,000 a year for for a team of 10. And so what I propose to do is and I haven't talked much here tonight, of course, about my corruption background and prosecuting corruption, but when we prosecute those cases and we work out, dispositions of companies, one of the things we can do is have them fund those ACT teams. We can have them fund certain programs. To me, that is vital here because again, there is that swath of people that again are not the Kirby type, right? And they're not guilty by reason of insanity, but because of their mental illness, we want to get them into sustained treatment. And that's a way to do it. And so that's what an ACT team is. It can give you both, sustained access to the counselors, to supportive services like housing and medical, medical attention for non-psychological things. So that's one way to kind of do that. And one of the wonderful things about the district attorney, and again, having done this work for so many years, I know that we can be that conduit. We can be the connector, again, because of the strength of, of that, criminal law tool. The second question, though, I think is much more important in a way. Those are much more disturbing, right? People that intentionally say we are going to single you out to make you feel less than because to make me feel better, right? Those are people that we do need to make sure are prosecuted. And again, we need to call it hate crime, and that means we need to use the enhancements. I'm not afraid to use prison where someone is committing an act of violence. I mean, many of my colleagues in this race think that prison should never be used again, it seems. And to me, I'm not about over criminalizing, but we need to use it as a deterrent. And if people understand that it's not okay to endanger somebody, to spit on someone, to hurt them in some way, I think there will be a deterrent value. So I do think that in those cases we need to be prosecuting and using the full brunt of the law to deter.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Jen, and thanks so much, Diana, for your thoughtful questioning and your thoughtful responses. We're nearing the end of our 30-minute segment here, and so I would like to open up the floor to see if any of our audience members have any questions. If any of the audience members do have any questions, please do input them into the chat function, and then I'll ask you to unmute and pose your question. Okay. Barring any questions from the audience, Diana, I promised that I would reserve several minutes for you at the end for any concluding remarks that you might have. So the stage is all yours.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I do want to go back one thing that I really didn't talk about. I do want to say that one of the big trends in hate crimes is often using restorative justice. And I do want to maybe address that for a moment. I think restorative justice has wonderful potential. And I think when it's done right, when it's done by professionals and not done as a trendy thing that you put in your office by someone who dabbles in it, it can be a good tool. But I want to tell you that as someone who has fought for 25 years for victims, I do worry with restorative justice, it being something of the moment, that victims will be intimidated into using it. So for me, it's not that I eschew restorative justice, but I do think that we need to be sure that victims are always protective and always feel that they have a voice. And if they have 1 second of hesitation that this is not for them, I want to make sure that they are not coerced or feel that they are pressured into entering a restorative justice. So with that said, if there's any other questions, I'll just go into my closing remarks, which is, it really does dovetail into it, which is, as you can see, for me, this work is very personal. I understand the transformative effects of doing the law the right way and using the criminal law the right way. For me, when I prosecuted the case of Carlos Moncayo, a 22-year-old who died in an unprotected trench because the developer on site could not be bothered to protect him. To me, the case itself, the four corners were horrifying. But for me, it was after we got the conviction, when I was proud to get that landmark conviction of manslaughter against the developer on site and his boss. What I saw was that his family and the immigrant community that Carlos was part of were completely transformed. They saw that the district attorney's office could work for everyday New Yorkers, could work for them even if they were undocumented. And that's ultimately, when I think about why I'm running, it's about restoring that faith in government and restoring the faith, particularly in the district attorney's office. I understand that for too long, the Manhattan DA's office has been, this castle in the sky that has not been accessible to all of us. And I understand that we have to do the work. It's not upon the community to come to us. We need to come to you and earn back that trust. Because I've been there for so long, I am the person that is best suited on day one to reform that office. I know that it needs much renovation. It has not changed in 25 years, but I know that working together, I don't presume to understand directly your experience as Asian Americans, but I understand what it's like to come out and talk to you and hear from you and work together to build a DA's office that reflects your values and my values. Because at the end of the day, we all really do want the same thing. We all want to feel safe at home, safe at work, and safe on the street, and no one should ever feel otherwise. And I will work every single day to ensure that. If any of you know me, I am the hardest worker in this race. I came directly from a subway station. I hand out my own leaflets. I have many volunteers because I am very fortunate to have great support across the labor unit and the communities. But I will tell you that my hardworking ethic will not end when I win this campaign. It will continue because it's who I am and who I've always been. And I hope to continue to work with you guys after I win this election. And I want to encourage you all, just end with this. Please vote. You can vote now, but you can also vote on election day, June 22nd. There's no ranked choice voting in this race, and I am first on the ballot. And you can remember my name because it's like the Diana, like the princess, and Florence, like the city.
Well, thanks so much, Diana, for your remarks and your commentary, and for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure learning more about your platform and your motivations for running. And we wish you a good rest of the night.
Thank you, you too. Thank you so much for having me. And please, do you want me to share my email, or can you share it? I'm happy for you to share my contact in the chat. I'm always happy to continue the conversation. And if there's things that you feel, if you've looked at my platform, you feel like there's some holes or you want to discuss, please do that.
Wait, if I could just ask one question, because I realized I asked the candidates last night that question. So just to be fair, I should probably ask you this question. So there are many instances, right, where someone gets arrested for an anti-Asian attack, but they get released again, and then right after they're released, they attack someone else. There may be mental illness, we don't know that, right? So what's your position on cash bail in those instances? And what kind of charges are you going to bring to make sure that they're not released right afterwards to continue attacking other Asian people?
I mean, I believe that these cases must be bail eligible. There's just no question. I mean, to me, we also, again, I think a lot of those cases, because they're being charged as misdemeanors, I think they're being undercharged, to be honest with you. And I'll just say this. In terms of bail reform, the way it was done, it's a perfect example of what happens when we don't talk to each other, because the bail reform that was done, I am certainly not here to say that we didn't need to reform bail. There certainly were issues, but to do it without understanding these unintended consequences, where we have people reoffending, and also people that are fleeing, because ultimately bail is about coming back to court. So for me, it's about, we need to go back to Albany. We need to work together, not adversarially. We need to say, look, as practitioners, we know this isn't working. And to me, ultimately, it's about funding an alternate bail system. It shouldn't be based on how much money you have, but it should be based on, whether you're going to flee and the severity of the charges. And these cases are very serious. So I absolutely support bail on these cases.
Okay, so I just want to take a moment to explain to the audience, most of whom are probably coming from immigrant backgrounds. And so in New York, the legislature passed a law that basically meant you can't ask for bail if you charge someone with a misdemeanor in most cases, right? And so when we have an anti-Asian attack, sometimes they get charged as aggravated harassment, if they get charged at all, and that's a misdemeanor. And so you can't ask for bail. And so, Diana, are you saying that in these instances, you're more willing to bring a hate crime enhancement to make it a felony so that you can ask for bail? Is that your position?
I mean, look, I'm not going to overcharge things. I'm not going to charge. It would not be ethical for me to say I'm going to charge it just to keep people in, for bail. But I will say that we need to be much more, sort of aggressive about calling things as they see it. As I said at the beginning, if it's a hate crime, then we need to use the enhancement. If it's not, it's not. But I think that that's my position.
Okay, so you would be more willing to charge people with aggravated harassment and in some cases with hate crime enhancements?
Absolutely, where it's appropriate. I will never shy. I am someone who's been really proud in my career. When I mentioned Carlos's case, that was landmark because manslaughter was never really done. Those were considered accidents in civil cases. I am someone that if the law and the facts collide, I'm going, even if it's a little bit risky, I'm going to charge it, because to me that's our job. If we wanted safe, we'd stay home. So we need to make sure that, again, the hate crimes need to be called what they are. And I'm not afraid to do that and stand up in court and do that.
Okay, thank you. We're sorry about keeping you a little bit longer. I hope you're okay with that. So.
I'm all good. My kids are keeping my food warm. It's all good. Thank you guys so much. I really do appreciate it. And I am, so do you want me to put my email in the chat real fast, or you can
Diana, that'll be wonderful if you want to just plug your contact information in the chat. And thanks again for joining us. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Yes, you know what? I can only put it. It doesn't look like I can put it. Only looks like I can't put it for everybody. It looks like I can only email different hosts. So do you want me to?
Yes. If you just chat it to me, I'll plug into the chat.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll do that right now. Thank you so much. Here we go.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks again. Okay.
Bye, Diana.
Bye, Diana.
Thank you. Have a great night, evening, all. Thanks again.
You too. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Great. And so to our audience members, it looks like we have about 7 or 8 minutes before our next featured candidate is joining. Thanks for tuning in so far. We hope that it's been an illuminating discussion, but we'll take a quick break and reconvene at 7:45. All right. Well, we're a minute early, but I think we can get started. Thomas, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us, for being a part of the forum tonight. We really look forward to talking through these important issues that impact the Asian American community here in the city, and learning more about your platform. Before we jump in, I'd like to introduce Yang Chen, who is the Executive Director of Albany, who will introduce our organization.
Good evening, Mr. Kenneth. My name is Yang Chen. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Bar Association of New York. We were founded in 1989 to represent the interests of Asian American legal professionals in New York City and state, as well as the Asian American community and the large community that we belong to. And we are currently about 1,500 members strong, which makes us the largest diverse bar association in New York City and New York State. And we believe that makes us the largest in the country. We are certainly the largest affiliate of NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, being the largest of some 90 affiliates across the country, representing approximately 60,000 Asian American attorneys. And we're very glad to have you here tonight with us.
It's a privilege to be here. It truly is.
Thanks, Yang. And so Thomas, just so you know what to expect for tonight, we'll be speaking for about 30 minutes. And I'll reserve a few minutes in the beginning and at the end for your introductory and closing remarks. But over the course of our conversation, several of my colleagues from the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force will take turns posing a few questions, and then I'll field a few questions from the audience, time permitting. But we extend a warm welcome to you once again, and thank you so much for taking part in tonight's forum. I'd like to introduce my first colleague, Karen Yao, who will ask the first question. Karen Yao is an Albany board member.
Hey, I'm happy to ask my questions, but I wonder maybe we can hear from Thomas first.
You are absolutely correct. Thomas, as promised, I just promised that to reserve a few minutes for introductory remarks, and I skipped right to Karen. I got a little excited to get our questions in. But if you'd like to take a minute or two for a brief introduction.
Yeah, no, and that's quite all right. I usually do better when someone lobs a question up to me, but I'm happy to introduce myself. My name is Thomas Kniff. I am the lone Republican nominee for Manhattan District Attorney. Just to give you a little bit about my background, I've been practicing for over 20 years, almost exclusively criminal defense. I started my career in the criminal justice world at the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, working under then DA Janine Pirro, then towards the later portion of my career there under now Chief Judge Janet DiFiore, who at the time was the elected district attorney in Westchester County. During the course of my time as an assistant district attorney, I also commissioned into the Army National Guard JAG Corps. And because of the reality of the global scene at that point, this was 2003, it didn't take long before I was put on active duty and deployed in combat to Iraq. I served a year with the 42nd Infantry Division based out of Tikrit, Iraq, although I moved around the country a bit as my job required me, my deployment required me. And when I was there, I was involved in a variety of military justice issues and defending soldiers accused of offenses. Upon my return stateside after my deployment, I continued my service at the district attorney's office, and then thereafter started my law firm with my current law partner, Stephen Razor, who also is an Iraq war veteran. And we founded the law firm of Razor and Kniff in 2006. And I've been practicing criminal defense in New York City since then, primarily in Manhattan. I am the most tenured criminal defense attorney in this race. So although my platform has a lot to do with restoring order in New York City, and what motivated me to run was really disgust at what I saw happening on the street level to a variety of New Yorkers, obviously, including Asian Americans. I also believe in fairness and due process. And I think as a district attorney, I'm in a unique position to have been on both sides of the criminal justice system and want to restore law and order in the city, but also certainly respect due process and the rights of the accused.
Great. Thanks, Thomas, for the introductory remarks. Karen, take two. I will pass the virtual microphone over to you. Once again, Karen now is a Albany board member.
Thank you so much. And Thomas, thank you so much for being here. And I'm more than happy to lob questions at you. As Tai said, a Albany board director, and I'm also a civil rights lawyer. So as you know, New York City has 14% of New Yorkers are Asian Americans, and more than 10% of Manhattanites are also Asian Americans. And yet Asian Americans constitute a significantly smaller number of ADAs in the Manhattan DA's office, and almost none in the top leadership positions. Will you, and how will you ensure that if you agree to have that?
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, certainly if I'm elected DA, diversity is going to be a top priority. I want to make sure that all New Yorkers of color, of whatever particular ethnicity, are represented at least proportionally to the numbers they occupy in society. That's fundamental fairness. I'll admit my ignorance. I didn't know that the numbers were so low, and I'm disappointed to hear that, because I've actually had the privilege of working with so when I was an assistant district attorney and as a defense attorney, as adversaries, some magnificent Asian American prosecutors here in the Manhattan DA's office and beyond. Actually, when I was applying to become an assistant district attorney, I did things a little bit unorthodox in that I did start my career at a very large corporate law firm. And after a couple of years there, it was a wonderful place, wonderful people. But I knew I wanted to be in the courtroom, so I kind of did this 180. And it was one of my colleagues there who had been a Bronx DA, assistant DA, who's a Chinese American, who really helped me along in the process and wrote me letters of support that were very helpful during the interviewing process. So, and in the military as well, I work with one of my top captains that worked under me for several years in my office. Is a Chinese American. So there's so much talent there, and of course they need to be represented. We'll do everything we can. I mean, I think a lot of it is recruiting, right? Going to the law schools, letting people know that what a great career they can have in criminal justice. A lot of law students, they're one track. They're looking for corporate law, the big law firms, the big paydays. We can't give that in the DA's office, unfortunately. but you can do so much more. I mean, it's really, I think criminal defense has been in the criminal justice system offers so much to a young lawyer, even if you're not going to stay there your whole career. I would not be the attorney I am today if I didn't start in a prosecutor's office.
Let me ask a follow-up question about that. Manhattan DA's office, unlike the one in Brooklyn and Queens, actually does not have an independent unit that focuses specifically on hate crimes and hate-motivated incidences. If you were the DA, would you develop one?
Well, there is, I mean, unless something changed very recently, I mean, there has been a hate crimes bureau in the Manhattan DA's office. I mean, I've litigated with them. You know, what the status of it is now and what they call it, you know, up until very recently, there was certainly a hate crimes bureau in the Manhattan DA's office.
So part of
whatever the past is, I can tell you that under my administration, there will be one. And, you know, we're going to focus very heavily on any crimes that are motivated by racial animus. There's no question. There is nothing more offensive than to the ideal of the American experiment to think that anyone should be targeted based on their ethnicity or their identity. And that needs to stop. We're gonna need help from our friends in Albany, because I think a lot of reason we're having the problems we're having today, and I'm happy to speak to this further, is because of the disastrous criminal justice reform that was passed in 2019. And unfortunately, that's put a target on a lot of people's backs, including obviously, as we all know, the Asian Americans, but perhaps most ubiquitously.
Yeah, one of my colleagues is going to turn to the recent bail reform a little bit later in our conversation.
Okay.
But I want to kind of clarify and, you know, be more educated about your experience at the Manhattan DA's office. My understanding is that the Manhattan DA's office does not have an independent unit that focuses specifically on hate crimes, with ADAs and investigators who do only that type of crimes. My understanding is that when they do, they are also carrying a caseload that focuses on other charges. Is my understanding correct?
That it's very possible. I don't know whether the ADAs assigned to the hate crime unit handle hate crimes exclusively. I know there is a hate crime unit. It was actually headed up until recently by an individual by the name of Michael Pasnikoff, who is a ADA that I tried a couple of heavy cases with. A very good litigator, very tenacious. More recently, I had a case with them.
Right. So my question to you, as you said, for you, under your administration, would you have one that would just have ADAs work on hate crimes, you know, and not other types of charges?
I would give a qualified yes, so long as the caseload was sufficient to keep those ADAs occupied. Frankly, based on what we're reading in the papers today and what's happened since bail reform, I would be shocked if there were not enough cases to keep them busy. If it was a situation where we had, let's say, a 10-person hate crimes unit, but the caseloads were such that the individuals assigned to that hate crimes unit either, you know, were carrying, you know, a fraction of the caseload that my other ADAs are, who are also prosecuting serious crimes, we'd either have to, you know, consider shrinking the unit, moving some personnel out of it, or perhaps having them assigned to handle other cases.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that thoughtful answer. Tyee?
Great. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Thomas. If I may, a quick follow-up on this theme of kind of dedicated personnel. Thomas, I think in the past, you've been a bit critical of the NYPD's having a dedicated hate crimes task force. Is that because you feel like that task force maybe doesn't go far enough? Is it because you think that there are other solutions to tackling problems like anti-Asian violence? How do we kind of reconcile maybe some of your stance with regard to the dedicated personnel on the law enforcement side, and some of kind of the comments you just made about having a dedicated bureau within the DA's office?
Well, sure. Well, let me start by saying I don't think I've ever been critical of the idea of having a dedicated bureau. What I have said is many, in my opinion, many politicians who are uncomfortable in dealing with certain tools that we have already to deal with this problem, because it might offend more extreme portions of their electoral base that they're appealing to, will come out and say is sort of like window dressing. Well, we need a hate crimes unit. We need an hate crimes task force in the NYPD. I have no conceptual problem with that. My problem is when that's used as a red herring to overlook the fact that these are the same people that supported disbanding the anti-crime unit, the plainclothes police that are tasked with, among other things, getting violent criminals out of places like the subways, where a lot of the crimes that have been perpetrated against Asian Americans and other New Yorkers are occurring, because they don't want to offend the Black Lives Matter crowd or the woke progressive, what I think extreme crowd. The same people who not only support, I mean, we have people in this race who brag about having wrote the bail reform law, right? You know, those are to me the biggest issues impacting and making the Asian Americans and all New Yorkers vulnerable right now. So if you want to talk about, hey, we're going to fix those, and in tandem with that, we're going to beef up the Asian unit, Asian hate crime unit, or the general hate crime unit, whatever, you know, I mean, we talk about names and titles all day long. I fully support it, but what I've tried to point out, maybe it's come off as criticizing the idea. It's not intended that way. Is that, you know, you have people in this race just yelling into an echo chamber, you know, task force, commission. This, well, wait a second. Let's look at what policies that you've stood for and still stand by. In fact, 7 out of 8 Democrats on the other side want to end cash bail completely, that have caused this problem to fester. And just yelling task force isn't going to, that in and of itself isn't going to fix anything. I know we're going to talk about bail reform later. We keep getting to it. It's happening organically, I promise.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, Thomas. And like Karen mentioned, one of my colleague, Jen Lowell, will flesh that out in greater detail in the time to follow. But I'd like to open the stage and pass the virtual microphone to Karen King, who is a chair member of the Pro Bono and Community Service Committee here at Albany, and has a few questions for you. Karen.
Hi, Thomas. Yeah, thanks so much. And I guess before we get to all of those issues, my question relates a little bit more about a prosecution that has kind of a long memory in the Asian American community, the prosecution of Abacus Bank back during the financial crisis, and what seemed to be a targeting and scapegoating of a local community bank who services the Chinatown community, where the large banks on Wall Street basically went untouched. And just curious what your thoughts are on that particular matter. And given the current US-China geopolitical situation, which has already kind of led to some of the problems on the street with anti-Asian violence, you know, what are your thoughts on ensuring that Asian companies and people are not targeted because it's politically sort of expedient to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and look, and there is a lot of Wall Street money in this race. A lot of it. Fortunately, I don't have any of it, but it's there. But yeah, look, we you know, as a district attorney, you know, I am always going to put fundamental fairness first. I've spent I may be the law and order candidate, and that's a title I wear proudly. I spent the last 15 years representing and defending the little guy. All right. And I would say, you know, not all my clients are high-end people that could pay big retainers. I actually spend a lot of my time, I consider it sort of my pro bono, on the 18B panel. I'm on the major felony and homicide 18B panel in Manhattan, have been for many years. It's very selective as the qualifications you need to get on that panel, particularly the homicide panel, but it also pays $75 an hour. And there's, I think we're all attorneys here, and you know, I don't need to opine on what a Spartan wage that is, particularly when you're running your own practice and paying overhead and paying secretaries and paralegals and so forth. But I do it. I think it's an obligation. Keeps me very, very sharp. I've had to try a lot of great cases through doing that. But I know what it means to defend and be the only mouthpiece for someone who is, the quote unquote underdog. And I don't mean that term pejoratively. I mean, you know the way we use it in society, someone who's not wealthy, someone who's not a member of the elite class, someone who is maybe part of a race or ethnicity who's getting scapegoated because the financial crisis or because of COVID, and perceptions that COVID evolved from one part of the world, and a lot of people theorizing that that's why we're seeing so much anti-Asian violence right now. I mean, that's absurd, right? So, I'll just have to, rely on my record. I mean, I think that anybody who looks at my background and so forth knows that I'm someone who's never shied away from a fight, never shied away from a challenge. I went to war for this country. I went to battle for my clients. And I have seen, unfortunately, too many examples of where certain people are treated one way because of who they are, because of how deep their pockets are, because of their last name, and others are treated another way. And that's not going to happen on my watch.
Thank you. Tyee, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Karen. And so Thomas, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Obviously, we want to reserve a substantial amount of time tonight to address the upsurge and that is deeply concerning in instances of anti-Asian violence that is kind of proliferating throughout our city. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the much anticipated bail reform issues as well. But I'll turn to it now and hand it off to Jen Luo, who is a member of our issues committee at Albany. Jen, the stage is all yours.
Okay, so that's a lot of pressure, but let's save that for later. So I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, Thomas, which is that you feel like you're like the lone wolf because you're the only Republican candidate.
The elephant in the room, I call it.
Right, and so
GOP, the elephant in the room. Okay.
So I'm sure it sounds like you're familiar, right? There's been a drastic rise in anti-Asian crimes, but at the same time, there is a valid concern, right? There is something very problematic that's happening right now with mass incarceration, and there is something very problematic with the racial disparities that's happening. I think that's regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat. I think we can all see that problem. That's well established. I think, the Asian community actually does share traditionally a lot of the marginalization with other communities of color. Just 2 years ago in SDNY, actually, the judge granted a discovery motion based on underlying statistical evidence that showed that the DEA had conducted these stings in minority communities, and that they were either Black, Hispanic, or Asian. So we do have that commonality, and so I don't want to let this be portrayed as something else. And so I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, which is that there's not enough cases to keep a hate crime unit going.
Well, I didn't say that. I said
there might not be enough cases to keep a hate crime unit going, right? And so,
well, I don't.
Why would you think that? Why? I mean, why do you think that might be?
Well, no. Well, I didn't say that. I mean, maybe it was taken that way. But what I had said was, I was asked whether I would have prosecutors that would exclusively work only on hate crimes, and my answer was, it was a qualified yes, as long as there was enough volume to keep them busy. And I added to that, I said, I can't imagine, given what's going on right now, that there wouldn't be, right? I would be very surprised, I'll say it again, if, I don't have access to the number of the caseloads and the number of cases and the breakdowns. I don't think any of the candidates in this race do. Given what I know and what I read in the paper, I would be shocked if there wasn't enough case volume at this moment in time, probably in recent history, to keep a hate crimes unit completely busy and allow the prosecutors in that unit to work exclusively on hate crimes. So I think there is a surge. And I think I know a lot of what the roots of it are, but there's no denying it.
So you're saying that you don't think there's enough, you would not be surprised if there's not enough reported cases to the DA's office right now?
No, I would be surprised if there weren't enough, right? I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that there's enough hate crimes in the city, right? You know, maybe not exclusively Asian, but all the different, you know, races and ethnicities or dispositions that people could cause people to motivate to commit a hate crime. I would be very surprised if there are not enough cases right now to justify a hate crimes bureau with prosecutors working exclusively on hate crimes. Does that make sense?
So I do want to correct you on that, right? Because there's actually been 59 cases that's already referred to the Manhattan DA's office. And I think actually last week, New York Times had an article that said of all the most high profile cases, unfortunately, only 2 have involved hate crime charges. So I don't think that's necessarily the case, that there's not enough reported cases to the Manhattan DA. I think, you know, there certainly is a possibility, right? That if you have prosecutors who might have implicit bias, they might be less, or unconscious bias, if that makes people more comfortable. They might be less open to the idea of an act being motivated by hate, being motivated by bias. So what would you do to address that possibility?
Well, I mean, first of all, hire the best people, the best supervisors, make sure that there is a structure to review cases internally within the office, to make sure that cases that should be prosecuted as hate crimes are being prosecuted by hate crimes. One thing I will point out, although I'll say again, I do not believe that there are so few cases of hate crimes that there's not enough to keep the Manhattan DA's office hate crimes bureau busy. I don't know how many of the most high profile cases, but there's certainly an epidemic of this right now. I think one of the problems maybe, though, that no one's picking up on is, you know, you can have a district attorney's office that wants to prosecute hate crime. You can have reasonably minded people like all of us who look at something and say, yeah, I know what's going on here. This is motivated by racial bias, but you still may lack prima facie evidence to charge the individual with a hate crime. And I know we don't want to talk about bail reform yet, but this goes back to the problem with bail reform, because most hate crimes, if they involve violence, are bail eligible offenses, even under the reform, the bail reform. However, many of them that we intuitively know, I mean, I'm talking specifically, remember the case of, I think it was about 2 weeks ago now, where we're on the video where the young man, apropos of nothing, walks up to the Asian woman and punches her in the face, right? Everybody know what I'm talking about? Got plenty of attention in the papers. We may look at that and say, look, you know, there's very little doubt, given what's going on in the world right now, that this person was motivated by racial bias or animus. But if he doesn't utter an ethnic or racial slur at the time that he throws that punch, if he doesn't have, let's say, a social media profile that's accessible to the prosecutors that show him making anti-Asian comments, tweets, posts, rants, what have you, and he doesn't give a statement or a confession to the police indicating that he was motivated by racial animus, there's not prima facie evidence there that's going to allow the prosecutors to charge a hate crime, and if they do, it's going to get dismissed. Now, you can have a hate crimes bureau that says, look, we may not be able to charge this as a hate crime. We may not be legally able to get that enhancement because of the way the law is written. But if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, acts like a duck, it's a duck, and we're still going to have the hate crimes bureau prosecute it. They may just have to prosecute it as an ordinary assault, but we're going to offer, let's say, a much more harsher plea offer, to the extent we're going to make an offer at all, because we know what's really going on here. That would be a way that I would certainly entertain as DA to get more cases into the Hate Crimes Bureau, although they might not qualify by statute as hate crimes.
Thank you. So I think that pretty much answered some of my questions, but I think the one thing that I do want to follow up on is something that you said, which is that the investigations piece, right? You're saying that there's not enough evidence. There's not enough evidence to bring the case if there's not enough evidence of motive.
Exactly.
I think the DA's office actually does also have investigators as well, right? So and that's why having an independent unit is important. If you train people on implicit bias, right, they're more likely to recognize the possibility of something being a hate crime, and then they're more likely to investigate it. So what are your thoughts, in that regard, in terms of having investigators and prosecutors who are independently trained and who are educated on implicit bias in terms of whether, and this might apply not just to hate crimes, right? This might apply to bring any kind of charges against other communities of color. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are I'm all for it. Absolutely. And talking about the example I used, I mean, look, absolutely. I mean, that's why I brought up the social media, the Facebook. It's a great place where when you have an arrest like that, where you want to start looking, because we all know so much of the hate that we see. Where is it? It's on Twitter, it's online, it's on Facebook. So, you look for that individual's public postings. If you have probable cause, you get a warrant to search their phone, to search their social media, and you see if there's a history of this person making disparaging comments towards the race or ethnicity of their victim. All right. Then you may have enough to establish motive in that case. Now, are there going to be cases where, hey, look, you just don't have that? I mean, if you have someone who is mentally unstable, living on the streets, not using Twitter, not using Facebook, maybe doesn't have a smartphone, sometimes you can investigate, 8 ways till Sunday, and you're just never going to get at what you're pretty sure is really there. But it doesn't mean that you can't still, as a prosecutor, that we can't consider those factors in how we handle a case and what sort of disposition we find that is acceptable in a case as egregious as that, even though we may not be able to statutorily get a hate crimes enhancement.
Right. But what about implicit training?
Yes, I think, there's absolutely, there's implicit bias. I've seen it. I've represented probably half the crime, the defendants I've represented have been people of color or people of ethnic minorities. I see that sort of bias all the time. You see the economic bias. Someone who can walk in there and have a private attorney and sometimes get treated a lot differently from the system than someone who walks in with a public defender. That's also one of the reasons why, even though I'm running for the prosecutor, I want to. The prosecutor's office certainly needs more resources, but we need to enhance the resources and the pay for public defense attorneys, including 18B lawyers. It is a travesty. It is a scandal, as a Court of Appeals judge once put it to me, who was a Manhattan Supreme Court judge who was at the time trying a case against, that we're paying defense attorneys $75 an hour to handle major felonies in New York. That's a big problem. So if you want to deal with implicit biases, both regarding who gets charged and who doesn't get charged, and how defendants are treated and perhaps treated disparately based on their socioeconomic status, getting them great defense attorneys is one good place to start.
Okay, well, that's a really long answer, much more than I asked for, but that's great. Okay, well, moving on to, see, the thing is, bail reform is not really what we've been focusing on, right? But what the question is more specifically in instances of hate crime, right, where you have these perpetrators who are arrested and charged, and then they're released, and then they attack another minority, and then they get charged again. Right? That's happening over and over again, and that in part is because of this bail act. But I think part of it also, I think let's focus on what's within your control, right? Because you're not part of the legislature, and again, the DA's.
Well, I'm not part of the legislature, but I disagree that we don't have influence and control over that. I mean,
but I'm saying you can't change the law, though, right? But there are ways where you can influence a lot, but you can't change it by yourself. Right?
No, no legislature can change it by themselves either. But it is not, in my opinion, it is naive to say that someone in the Manhattan District Attorney, I'm talking about probably the most powerful prosecutor in the state, one of the top 5 in the country, particularly if, for instance, if I was elected as a Republican in a Democratic town. But even one of the Democrats, unfortunately, there's only one of them that would even seek to deal with bail reform. would have a tremendous mandate. And the legislatures up in Albany are already flailing on this. There's a lot of them that's become a big issue in different races. So having the power of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the mandate of getting elected on with bail reform is one of my marquee issues, and it is. And being able to use that influence to lobby Albany is going to have a tremendous impact. Could I go in there and change the law myself? No, of course not. The governor can't do that. No single legislature can do that. But we can have a tremendous amount of influence on it.
So I just want to clarify to the audience, right? Because most of our audience tonight may not know the law and they're coming from an immigrant background. Or I'm not talking about the influence that the DA has on the legislature. I'm talking about as a matter of legal structure of law. The DA's office cannot pass laws, right?
Yes, I never said that we could.
I'm not talking to you. So I'm just explaining it to our audience that the legislature is responsible for passing the law. The DA's office can lobby or maybe influence the legislature, but the DA's office does not pass laws, which is why we're not talking about necessarily bail reform. We're just talking about instances involving hate crimes where the perpetrators are repeat offenders. And because of this law that had been passed, right? If you bring misdemeanors against them, they get released no matter what the DA says. And so what will you do in this kind of instance? Does that mean you're going to bring higher charges that are not misdemeanors that you can ask for bail? Because that's something that's within your control, legally speaking.
Well, I respectfully disagree with you again, because it's not exclusively within the prosecutor's control. We can't just charge crimes that aren't substantiated by the evidence. That's the same reason why I was talking before about how there may be a crime where we all know intuitively it is more likely, certainly much more likely than not, motivated by hate or bias, but you have to have the evidence, you have to have the facts. What a lot of people who defend bail reform don't understand, and what a lot of my potential opponents in this race are passing off to people, we hear a lot about these no prosecution lists and we'll prosecute misdemeanors. A lot of people don't understand how violent a misdemeanor offense can be. And that's one of the reasons why I talked about the instance of a couple of weeks ago with the woman who was punched in the face. All things being equal, that's a misdemeanor offense. What separates a misdemeanor assault from a felony assault in New York is, generally speaking, a weapon. And if someone doesn't have a knife, they don't have a bat, they don't have a gun, it's presumptively a misdemeanor assault. The only other way to elevate it to a felony would be intent to cause serious physical injury. The serious physical injury threshold in New York is extremely high. It's basically death or dismemberment. In fact, the physical injury threshold for misdemeanor assault is much higher than most people think. So if someone's looking at that offense, I've handled misdemeanor assaults where the victim has died, both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, from a misdemeanor assault. So if you're looking at that offense that we were talking about, and there's been so many others like this, I'd like to charge that as a bail eligible offense 8 ways till Sunday. I'd like to see that person charged with a felony. I'd like to see them charged with a hate crime if it's appropriate. But if I don't have motive and I don't have a weapon and I don't have evidence of intent to cause serious physical injury, which is almost impossible to get from a physical punch or a kick, you're stuck with charging a misdemeanor. And that means, as you pointed out correctly, that under the bail reform, they can do that repeatedly and they need to be put back out on the street. I don't think anyone who truly understands the law can say, hey, we want to deal with hate crimes, but at the same time, we support the bail reform. They're just diametrically in conflict. And anybody who says otherwise or thinks otherwise, in my opinion, is either not being straightforward or just doesn't understand the law.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So we actually have, we've exceeded the time, but I really want to ask you one question, which is particularly relevant to you because of your experience defending those in the military. And I think you said were accused of misconduct, right? So 2 years ago, there was an Asian woman who jumped to her death during an undercover police sting at a massage parlor. And so just, in fact, a couple months before that, she had filed a report with the police alleging that a police officer had put a gun to her head and asked for her sexual services. And so, how will you protect these massage parlor workers while at the same time reduce the demand for prostitution and also reduce human trafficking?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Unfortunately, there's been a push to legalize prostitution. The current DA, Cy Vance, has said he's not going to prosecute prostitution cases anymore. I think that's a mistake because human trafficking and a lot of other illicit activities often supports prostitution. Now, unfortunately, people think that, or many people think that a prosecution means conviction, means incarceration. The majority of prosecutions in New York end without jail and without even criminal convictions. So if we have a case that's against someone's running a massage parlor and perhaps the workers there are there because they have no other choice, they're economically marginalized. A lot of them have been smuggled into the country and they have to pay off debts to coyotes and snakeheads, and that's why they're in the industry to begin with. And certainly, it's not the people working in those places that we're after. So if to the extent that there is an arrest and a prosecution, then certainly we'd be looking towards rehabilitation. A lot of times narcotics are involved in that the individuals doing the performing the sex work have a dependency, and that's something else they're trying to support with the by engaging in that activity. So there's plenty of things that we can do to try to use the hand of a criminal prosecution as a helping hand rather than a stick. Now, you brought up, I'm not familiar with the case you brought up, but if there's ever a situation where someone is accusing a police officer of sexual exploitation or attempted rape, then any police officer, I may be a law and order candidate, but any police officer, and I think we need to support the police as an institution. Any police officer out there thinks that if they're going to violate their oath, their sacred trust, and perpetrate a crime against those that they're there to protect, I don't care if it's a sex worker or a Wall Street big shot, they think they're going to have a friend in my administration, they're going to be sorely mistaken. So certainly anything with a complaint that egregious against a law enforcement officer would be taken very seriously and thoroughly investigated by my office.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I apologize if I'm a little bit harder on you because this is a question on prostitution that most of the other candidates have been given a lot of airtime. So I didn't see a lot of airtime given to you on this question, which is why that I have to ask you this question. So thank you so much.
All right, welcome the questions.
Thank you, Jen, for the thoughtful questions, and thank you, Thomas, for the responses. Thomas, I attempted to not deny you your a few minutes of introductory remarks at the beginning, but I will make sure to give you a few minutes now for your concluding remarks. So if you'd like to take a minute or two to wrap up, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, listen, I want to thank you all for having me. As the Republican candidate and the elephant in the room, we're always looking for opportunities to reach people, because I truly believe that if voters are willing to vote the issues and vote the candidates' positions and not the party, that I'll be enormously successful in this race. Obviously there's a lot of Democrats in the city, and that's fine, but I was spending most of my time speaking with Democrats. One, because they're just plentiful here, and two, they're the people that I know I have to reach in order to be successful. I can tell you that overwhelmingly, when I have street level encounters with people and talk to them about my issues, I've been embraced, because I believe we're at a point in this city where if we don't turn things around, we will lose this city. There is, in my opinion, I know we try to keep bail reform from not dominating the conversation, but if we don't reform the bail law, or worse yet, elect any of the Democrats, and it's almost all of them that are promising to double down on it by eliminating cash bail altogether, by not prosecuting misdemeanors anymore, is based on just the few examples we had time to talk with today. Every law-abiding innocent New Yorker is going to be more vulnerable. Certainly every person of color, every person of Asian descent, what have you, is going to be more vulnerable. And there is no doubt in my mind we'll lose this city. We will lose this city, and it will take generations to get it back. And it's why I'm here. I have a very successful law practice. I have a wonderful family. I never had any real desire to go into politics or be the district attorney, but I was offered this opportunity. And what motivated me to raise my hand and accept it is, one, because, well, I don't like backing down from a fight, but two, or I probably should have said first, is I see what's happening in the city. I see what's happening in the people in this city, and it's a place I love, and it's unacceptable. We can have law and order, we can have fairness, we can have due process. None of those things are mutually exclusive. I've been practicing in this adversarial system for all my life on both sides, and I think I know we do best when we have prosecutors that prosecute fairly, and we have criminal defense attorneys that defend zealously. So I thank you for all the time you gave me, and I hope everybody will really take the time to look at where I stand on the issues, not what I say or who I am, but where I am on the issues. And if you have a moment, go to my website, cnif4da.com. We lay out the whole platform there, and I think it's something that Democrats and Republicans, if they're at all reasonable, will be able to agree on.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. We thank you for your time and your participation. It was a pleasure hearing from you.
It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Yes, everything's working now. Thanks so much for taking time to join our forum tonight. We extend our warmest of welcomes to you. Before we begin the programming, I'd like to introduce our executive director, the executive director of Albany, Yang Chen, who is going to introduce our organization.
Good evening, Ms. Orleans. My name is Yang Chen. I'm the executive director of the Asian American Bar Association of New York. We call ourselves Albany for short. We were established in 1989, and we are currently about 1,500 members strong, which makes us the largest diverse bar association in New York. And we believe it makes us the largest diverse bar association in the country. We are certainly the largest affiliate of NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, out of some 90 affiliates across the country, representing some 60,000 Asian American attorneys across the US. So we welcome you, and we look forward to hearing your answers to some of our questions. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you
Yang.
so much for having me, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you this evening.
Great. Thanks, Yang, and thanks, Eliza. Eliza, just so you know what to expect for tonight, we'll be speaking for about 30 minutes during this segment. I'll reserve a few minutes in the beginning and at the end for your introductory and concluding remarks. And over the course of our conversation, a few of my colleagues from the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force will take turns posing a few questions. And then time permitting at the end, I'll field one or two from the audience if there are any. And so, yeah, to jump straight in, would you like to take a minute or two for a brief introduction?
I'd love to. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Eliza Orleans, and I am the public defender running for Manhattan District Attorney. And I have spent my career here in Manhattan at the Legal Aid Society in the criminal defense practice, representing over 3,000 people who couldn't afford to hire a lawyer. And so I've really seen the cruel, unjust way our criminal legal system operates, the ways in which it doesn't keep us safe, the way it over-prosecutes certain offenses, and meanwhile turns a blind eye to other very serious crimes being committed. And so I am running on a platform of bringing about real reform to an office that I think has had a lot of problems, especially throughout the Vance administration. I'm particularly happy to be here with all of you tonight because I think talking about these issues of anti-Asian sentiment and hate crimes and all these things is so important, and it's very deeply personal to me. I have a sister, she's adopted, she's Chinese, and I lived in Beijing when I was younger. I don't want to presume that any Mandarin speakers are on here, so I won't break into Mandarin, but I speak conversational Chinese. But anyhow, when I was a kid and I would go pick up my sister, we went to the same elementary school, and I'd go pick her up after class. I remember sometimes she'd be crying because other kids would have been racist towards her. So when people talk about, the rise in racism and anti-Asian sentiment, okay, maybe it's certainly gotten worse, with the way in which our former president talked about Asians and Asian Americans, but this is something that has always existed. And so, I remember standing up for my sister when we were kids, to the kids who were racist to her in our schoolroom, in our schoolhouse, and really just saying, like, this is not okay. And so recognizing the deep racism that exists, the hatred that exists, and understanding that this is a huge issue and something that that I've always fought back against and will continue to do as district attorney. And, I don't want to take too long. I know you said brief introduction, so just wanted to tell you a little bit about my family. I'm sure we'll get into my legal career plenty, but just wanted to briefly mention that. And thanks again for having me and having these important conversations. The Manhattan DA race is arguably the most important one on the ballot next Tuesday. I can't believe it's so soon, 6 days. It's not ranked choice, and, no term limits. And this is, there have been 2 DAs in my lifetime. So, this is a critically important race. So I really appreciate all of you engaging on this. And I'm sure you have a lot of thoughtful and important questions. So I'm excited to chat with you.
Thank you for the introduction, and we appreciate your time. We know this is the home stretch for you. And you mentioned kind of the upsurge in instances of anti-Asian violence. That's definitely something that I'd like to reserve a good amount of time tonight for. But before we turn to that series of questions, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Karen Yao, who has a question for you. Karen Yao is an Albany board member.
Hi, Eliza. So Eliza, you may have just muted yourself.
Hello.
Okay, great. So Eliza, I am a civil rights lawyer in addition to being a Albany board director. And my question to you have to do with how you will be developing the talent in your office. Asians constitute about 14% of New York City's population and more than 10% of the Manhattanites. And yet Asian Americans constitute a significantly smaller portion of the ADAs in the Manhattan DA's office and almost none in the top leadership positions. So will you have Asian American DAs in top positions, and how will you ensure that?
That's a fantastic question and a really important one, because representation has been a huge problem among district attorneys in the Manhattan DA's office. It's been incredibly devastating to see the ways in which certain people get prosecuted and the ways in which it impacts folks who, are people who are prosecuted by the Manhattan DA's office, and meanwhile, who are not represented by the people who are doing those prosecutions. I mean, Asian Americans are severely underrepresented in assistant district attorneys. And I have represented so many Asians and Asian Americans who are facing unique challenges, who are not, there's no understanding, no cultural awareness from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office when they bring those prosecutions because of the lack of representation. So I am absolutely and deeply committed to having Asians and Asian Americans in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, but it kind of goes deeper than that. And I think another facet of that is having data and transparency, with regards to, the types of cases that are brought. I mean, there's an abject lack of transparency with the Manhattan DA's office right now. And there's nothing that's going on that actually lays out the ways in which these crimes are charged. The racial breakdown of the charges, and I think that there should be a breakdown, not just saying, oh, this person was white, Hispanic, Asian, other, Black, et cetera. It should be a breakdown because not all Asians can be lumped together into one category. So there should be a specific breakdown in that regard as well.
Eliza, I agree with you that how the office is staffed necessarily has an impact on what charges are being brought. Let me ask a follow-up question. Manhattan's DA's office, unlike other offices, does not right now have an independent unit of ADAs and investigators whose work focuses solely on prosecuting and investigating hate crimes and hate-motivated incidences and nothing else. Under your leadership, will you have such an independent unit?
So that's a great question. And I think that, it's really an important one, and it's something that we need to stand up for. I've seen the persecution, as the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, I've seen the persecution of Jews. I've seen the racism that my sister has experienced. I've seen the ways in which, the system itself is racist. In terms of an independent investigation in charging hate crimes, I hadn't thought about nor proposed an independent unit to do so. But I do think that there should be we should certainly be speaking out against hate. We should certainly be doing things in terms of community investment and ensuring that people who are the best suited to address these issues within communities should be doing so.
Now, Eliza, my understanding is that you have proposed to cut the DA's budget by 50%. How will you be able to, as you said, appropriately investigate and hold accountable the alleged perpetrators of these hate-motivated crimes if the budget is so severely curtailed?
Well, that's fantastic, because I talk about this often, because a lot of people have questions with regards to the cutting of the budget of the Manhattan DA's office. But, so many of the crimes that are charged by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office are crimes that are very low-level offenses, crimes involving drug possession, personal possession of drugs, involving low-level crimes, the overwhelming majority of misdemeanors. These are not issues involving public safety, certainly not involving violence. And those cases are ones that I don't believe should be being brought through the criminal legal system. And in fact, thankfully, now that we are electing progressive prosecutors across the country, people like Rachel Rollins in Boston, there are longitudinal studies done, such as the one by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which shows that when she had this decline to prosecute policy for these low-level offenses, it actually prevented, it made it less likely that someone would have future contact with the criminal legal system. That in fact, that prosecuting these low-level offenses leads to someone cycling back through and back through and back through the system, which makes perfect sense, because as a public defender, I've represented people who, even if they've only been in jail for a matter of a few days, have lost their jobs from not showing up to work, have lost their homes because they then couldn't afford to pay their rent, have been, lost their kids to foster care, have been coerced into taking pleas, which result in their inability to get loans or get jobs or get education or get housing. And so, of course that cycle perpetuates. So, the question about the budget, sorry, to get back to your original point about the budget, is that when we decline to prosecute these low-level offenses, which constitute over 70% of the cases that are coming through the Manhattan DA's office, so tens of thousands of cases are utilizing the resources and the massive budget of that office, and that ADAs are having to turn over discovery for every one of those cases and review and redact video from 6 officers at the scene now with their body cams for every single one of those cases. And the massive amount of resources can really be redirected towards investigating very serious offenses that come through. Of course, violent hate crimes are horrifying and should absolutely be investigated and prosecuted appropriately.
Eliza, thank you for those thoughtful answers. Tyee?
Great. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Eliza, for those answers. I will next turn to Karen King, who is chair of our Pro Bono and Community Service Committee. Karen, the stage is all yours.
Hi there, and thanks so much for joining us. Just jumping off of your point about sort of a waste of resources and spending all this money on kind of documents and investigation. One of the cases that costs the most money that really resonates with the Asian American community is the prosecution of Abacus Bank, local bank, community bank, services Chinatown, and it was, prosecuted, scapegoated during the financial crisis, while the big banks on Wall Street kind of, got ignored or just, turn a blind eye. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that kind of prosecutorial discretion, and how in this day and age with US-China, politics being what they are, we can ensure that Asian Americans and businesses are not targeted because of the political environment, and that, discretion will be applied fairly and thoughtfully.
Well, I mean, I talk about that case often. I have met the Sung family. I have spoken out about I think that you're absolutely right. The scapegoating of the Asian American community has taken many forms, and one of those, and I think that one of the most notable was, of course, the Abacus Bank case, and how Cy Vance. I was working as a public defender at the time, and I remember, because the hallways, what they do, I'm sure many of you have been inside of 100 Center Street, but if you haven't, and seeing on days when they're what they call press cases, they'll rope off the the sides of the hallway on whatever floor the case is on, and then they'll have the press just lining the hallways. And I remember, because it's harder for us public defenders to do our jobs when there are big press cases, and we're like, what is this case? What's going on? There are a ton of people. And I remember seeing, the Sung family being paraded through the courthouse, like in handcuffs, in shackles. And the way in which Cy Vance brought that prosecution was absolutely horrifying, despicable, disgusting, and racist. And, meanwhile, turning a blind eye to the crimes committed by, financial institutions where they either had the money to pay him off, or, they were friends, or they'd made massive campaign donations to his campaign. And, I think that is exactly why it's so important to have a district attorney who will put an end to racist prosecutions, not just of low-level offenses, but making sure that Asian businesses aren't targeted. This is something that can never happen again. Despite the fact that they were able to achieve a full acquittal, the Sung family had to sink millions of dollars of their own money into that defense. And the fact that Vance's office took that case all the way to trial and put them through that. And even with an acquittal, something that public, it's life ruining forever. And, I think that, that's a horrific example of the racist way in which Cy Vance's office has operated.
Thanks so much. Tai, I'll let you turn it over.
Great, thanks, Karen. And so, Eliza, the final kind of series of questions we have for tonight, I promised at the outset that we would dedicate time to the upsurge and proliferation of instances of anti-Asian violence in our city. I have a colleague, Jen Luo, who is a member of our issues committee, and she'll be asking you several questions from here on out. Jen.
Hi, thank you, Tai. So nice to meet you, Eliza. I want to, it's great that you mentioned that you feel the pain of the Asian community, that you have an Asian sister who's adopted, and you mentioned that increased reporting is necessary, but I'm just wondering, there's so much pain and trauma in the Asian community right now, right? And it's not just the trauma of these individual hate attacks. It's the sense that our trauma is not being recognized by the legal system, right? And so what do you say? I mean, what do you say to the Asian community? Are you just going to say, I'm going to focus on education? How are you going to go about doing that?
Well, thanks, Jen. It's, it's not like there's some ability to say, I'm going to snap my fingers and end structural racism that exists and end the hatred that exists. These are, as I mentioned in my opening, deep-seated issues. And I think we've seen it play out in so many different ways here in New York, across the country. I mean, the fact that so many people wouldn't call out the horrific shooting that we saw in Atlanta as being racially motivated, when it was quite clear that this was, it was deliberately targeted against Asians, you know, and it's like people are willing to call these things out when the victims are, you know, are Jewish. I'll tell you that, like, as someone who is Jewish, you know, people are like, anti-Semitism, this is terrible. But when it's anti-Asian, well, we can't say yet whether or not this was racially motivated. And so I think that, you know, there's so many things that need to be done. And so, you know, I understand, of course, and obviously I can't say I understand on a, you know, personally myself, but certainly, you know, my sister, my nephew, like this, you know, that's my family. And so understanding, you know, what Asian communities truly experience. And I think that feeling unrecognized by the legal community, but not just the legal community, the broader community as a whole. And I think that, you know, there are so many things that people are not willing to acknowledge. And I think, you know, there are some things that the law can do, but I also think that, you know, when people say, oh, if we charged more hate crimes, it would solve the issue. And I don't think that that's necessarily true either. I think that, you know, it doesn't, we've seen hate crime legislation get passed after certain instances, and it has actually not done anything to substantially or even at all necessarily deter hate crimes. So, you know, I think that there's a lot that needs to be done, but I do think that we need to be pushing for investment in, you know, in community-based organizations, in life-affirming services, in you know, organizations that are dedicated to serving Asian Americans who are the most vulnerable to, you know, structural violence.
Well, first of all, thank you for recognizing that there is an issue. However, I'm just wondering, you put out this policy that you won't prosecute low-level misdemeanors. I guess I just want to know what is your position on the type of anti-Asian attacks or the type of hate crimes, right, where someone punches someone, and what is your position versus someone who is stabbed, right, like that, or someone who is just dumped on viciously, like the Brendan Ely incident. And, you know, in that instance, what would be your idea of restorative justice?
Well, first of all, you know, I laid out a policy of declining to prosecute low-level offenses, but that certainly does not, and that's why I specifically called out, you know, a handful of, or a few more than a handful of misdemeanor cases that I would continue to prosecute. One of them being assault 3, because, you know, I have opponents in this race who say, oh, I'm not going to prosecute any misdemeanor, but to not be able to prosecute an assault 3 means if someone is punched, then you're not going to prosecute that case. And I think that is, you know, that's not a position I'm willing to take. I think, you know, those cases, of course, should be prosecuted, as well as stabbings. Of course, I mean, these are, or vicious, you know, stompings, God forbid. But I do think that, you know, in cases where, and of course with restorative justice, as is the practice across the board in places that actually use it, as opposed to Manhattan, you know, the victim needs to opt in. And so it turns out, though, and Common Justice, who does work in Brooklyn and in the Bronx, Danielle Serra, the executive director, put out these unbelievable statistics, which is even the victims of violent crimes, 90% of the time, when given the option, opt into restorative justice. And I think that's a pretty staggering statistic, because that, you know, really indicates that people, most of the time, even if a prosecution is brought, it does nothing to help the victim. You know, there's no investment in services for that person. There's like oh, someone burned down your house, great, we're going to chase that person down and burn their house down too, but you're still standing there looking at the ashes where your house used to be. To what end? You know, like it doesn't actually bring your house back. So I think that restorative justice, when that's something that the victim wants to do, is and can be extremely valuable to all parties involved.
So as a follow-up to that question, I mean, what exactly do you mean by restorative justice?
Of course. So I'll give an example. So there was a case that used restorative justice practice, and I think that the outcome is one that is, you know, a good scenario for everyone involved. But essentially, there was a man who was mugged, I would say, like was held kind of in a chokehold and had his property taken. And they were able to apprehend the perpetrator, who admitted responsibility. But the man who had been robbed was experiencing pretty severe PTSD from the attack, like was scared every time he walked outside. Even if, you know, there was a 90-year-old woman behind him, he was like, you know, feeling terrified when he went outside. He couldn't go to work. He was really experiencing horrible after effects from this attack. And the prosecutor said, hey, would you like to opt in to restorative justice? And he's like, sure, why not? Like, you know, I mean, nothing else is really working. So what they do is they'll put both people in a room together and have a conversation. Obviously, there are social workers present, other people are present. And the man who had been attacked told the perpetrator, this is what this has done to my life. It has upended my life. You know, I've been experiencing these things. I can't sleep. I'm anxious all the time. This is my life now. And then they like pass the talking stick. There's like a talking stick, pass it back to the man who had perpetrated this crime. And they said, okay, now it's your turn to speak. And he said, you know, I have to say, I never really considered you in all of this. You know, this is, every man in my family is locked up. My brothers, my dad, my grandpa was locked up. My uncle was locked up. I knew it was just a matter of time until I got locked up too. And it never really occurred to me to think about you in this process. And so they're supposed to come up together with like a way of, you know, coming together. So he says, but you, man, you never learned to defend yourself. You never learned how to fight. And the guy's like, yeah, no, I didn't. And he said, oh, okay, well, you know, I could teach you. And the guy's like, okay. And so Danielle tells this story, the executive director of Common Justice, and she's like, we're all super nervous. And we're like, oh God, like, what's this going to be like? But they book like this boxing gym or something, and they bring the two of them there. And he's like, okay, now he says to the man who's the victim, he's like, okay, now grab me from behind, now grab me like this. And he's like, now I'm going to show you how to get out of it. You like pull and then twist. And here's how you get out of it. And he like keeps showing him. He's like, now hold me tighter, tighter, tighter. And he's like, okay, now we're going to switch. And so not only is this man who's been attacked being held in a position that has been given him such trauma, and but it's by the person who actually did this to him. And he's like, okay, I'm going to do it softly at first. Okay, now harder now. And by the end of the day, the guy's like getting out of chokeholds, like really feels empowered. But you know, the day had gone pretty well. Everyone goes home, and Danielle tells this story and says, and we felt good about it, and everybody was being provided, you know, treatment and services and talking about this afterwards and everything. But she's like, I got a call from the victim, you know, the next afternoon. And he said to me, Danielle, you're not going to believe this. I went out in the street and I felt nothing, which, you know, obviously may not sound like much, but for someone who's been experiencing, you know, really these terror symptoms, it was incredible. And he's like, so I ran to the most crowded place I could think of. I went to Times Square, and there are people coming at me from every direction, and I wasn't scared anymore. And of course, you know, both men received treatment and services and help throughout, you know, for years afterwards. But, you know, this man was able to overcome this trauma of what he experienced. And I will tell you, the perpetrator has, you know, never reoffended, has gotten his life on track as well. And so, you know, I think about restorative justice. I just think that example really does exemplify the ways in which restorative justice can bring people together, can really be a healing experience for everyone involved, rather than just, you know, okay, great, punitive, we're going to lock up this person who did perpetrate this horrible attack, you know, and then this man still lives with the repercussions of that forever.
Well, I mean, that's definitely a very inspiring story for sure. And thank you for sharing that. And I think it shows that restorative justice, when it works, right, it can lead to good results. But I'm also curious, you know, like in the vast majority of these, well, maybe not vast majority, but in some instances, or at least are reported in the media, right? Like the people who are perpetrators, they clearly have very serious mental illness issues, right? And so if you tell them, okay, you got to do this hours of community service, you got to meet with the victims, they may refuse not to do that, right? And so what do you do then if they refuse to do that? And even in instances where they do agree to do that, right? So there's I think some of these nonprofits, there's very few nonprofits that actually accept defendants with violent felonies. And so they would not be eligible to get those type of services. And so I guess my question is really two-part, right? The first part is, how do you deal with these defendants who refuse to engage in restorative justice? And secondly, what about those defendants who might agree to it, but frankly just aren't eligible?
Well, so I'll address the first question first, which is people who refuse to engage in restorative justice. Obviously, it requires buy-in. I mean, that's just kind of the premise. It requires buy-in from both sides. When it's offered, it often is something that can be very successful, which I think that story exemplifies quite well. But of course, if someone doesn't want to participate, refuses to participate, or the victim is not interested, like, this is something that it can't go forward. So that's, and then cases will have to be dealt with appropriately, because, there have to be things that address these issues in a very serious way, especially serious crimes. But I will say that so many of these situations, it's like, there's been such a policy failure that got us to that point. The fact that mental health issues have been criminalized, and so many of these people use the fact that, someone who is, who's perpetrated one of these crimes is someone who's previously been locked up and is obviously mentally ill, as evidence that they should be locked up in the future. And it's like, well, no, it's really evidence that locking them up was such a failure to begin with. This is someone who obviously at some point, an intervention where they were provided the services that they needed for mental health issues could have probably prevented this down the line. But there's been massive policy failures that got us to this point. And then the second, did I answer? What was the second question? I'm so sorry. It's been a long time.
The question was the fact that a lot of these nonprofits that do offer restorative justice, right? They don't accept defendants with violent felony histories. The ones that do, they're severely underfunded, right? And you as a DA obviously has no control over their funding. You might lobby for it. As I think somebody else made a similar point earlier, but you ultimately have no control over their budget. So even if you do refer them to restorative services, they most likely can't get it. And then, so what is your response to that?
Well, thankfully, there are organizations that exist that do work specifically with violent crimes, and Common Justice being one of them. But I do think that the underfunding of nonprofits in our city is abysmal. It's really a huge issue, and the fact that, what did they spend on Thrive? Was it $1 billion of taxpayer money on Thrive that was supposed to be addressing mental health issues in our city, and instead was a campaign led by the mayor's wife to destigmatize mental health, but was completely, I think, unsuccessful in dealing with so many of these issues. And so, yes, this is something that is a huge problem in our city, and I hope very much so that the next mayor and the next city council and the next, everyone making budgetary decisions, obviously the district attorney does not do that, will fund programs that accept people, especially people who need it the most, people who are experiencing serious mental health issues, because that is something that makes our city feel less safe for everyone. I think I take the subway all the time. I literally I hopped off the 2 train to come back here because I was uptown at an early vote location. But when someone seems like they're unwell and they're on the subway platform, it can be very scary for New Yorkers. And I think that, I worry about myself, my parents, the people that I love, this city that I love. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is make sure that we are advocating for investment into mental health treatment and services, because the biggest provider of mental health treatment in New York City is the Department of Corrections. And I think there's something so deeply wrong with that. And obviously they're not doing a very good job.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's the conclusion of all the questions I have. I'll turn it over to Ty.
Well, thanks for those great questions, Jen.
Thanks, Jen and Eliza. We're nearing the end of this segment of today's programming. I did promise the audience that if they had any questions, I would turn to them. If, audience members, if you do have any questions, please input them into the chat box. But while we're waiting for questions to come in, I believe Karen Yao has one final question, a question that's come out from community members time and time again.
Right. Eliza, you've been very vocal about the conditions of Rikers Island, and I assume that you support the mayor's plans to close Rikers Island and his plan to replace it with locally based jails. The locally based jail in Manhattan's Chinatown, however, is planned to be a skyscraper. How will you ensure, well, first of all, do you support it? And second, how will you ensure that low-income and elderly Asian American immigrants will not be disproportionately affected by this building of this new huge jail?
Well, so first of all, yes, I've been outspoken that Rikers Island is a hellhole, and anyone who's ever been there knows that is a fact. You know, it is a place that violates human rights and human dignity on a daily basis. It is something that so desperately needs to be closed, and you know, the sooner the better. It should be closed immediately. However, I don't support the plan to build new jails. I don't think we should be building new borough-based jails. I don't think we, you know, we don't need them if we have a DA who's decarceral, who doesn't just default to jail and prison as, you know, the answer to every societal issue. So I think they're, you know, obviously the current facility at 125 White Street has its issues, of course, but I don't think that we should be building a skyscraper jail in its place, and do not support that. I do not support the fact that it's being built in Chinatown, that it will, you know, cast a literal shadow over the residents of Chinatown, which is obviously the most heavily Asian neighborhood in all of Manhattan. So, you know, it will displace and disproportionately impact low-income and Asian members of, low-income and elderly Asian members of the community, and it is absolutely unacceptable. You know, I will be a vehement advocate against building that new jail, and will oppose it as I always have throughout my career as a public defender.
Well, thank you for that response.
Great, thanks, Karen and Eliza. Eliza, we are just about out of time, but if you have concluding remarks, please feel free to take a minute or two to wrap us up.
Well, thank you so much for having me, for taking the time, and for such thoughtful questions. You know, as I said, I've spent my career as a public defender, and I've been an outspoken advocate for Manhattanites my entire career. I've represented 3,000 people who couldn't afford a lawyer, and have really seen the ways in which we need to change the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. You know, I think the last thing we need is another career prosecutor who's going to be more of the same. You know, I remember a Chinese man that I represented who had you know, lost his case in immigration court. And so when he got arrested and the Manhattan DA's office prosecuted, you know, broken windows offenses, these low-level offenses, even though they offered him a disorderly conduct and time served, you know, he had a deportation order. So he had an ICE hold. And I remember fighting that with every fiber of my being, and his family being in court and talking to them in Mandarin and speaking to him and really trying everything we could But because of the situation, we eventually had to just kind of say, okay, I guess he's going to be deported to a country that he hasn't lived in 25 years. And even though his wife and his children and his grandchildren are here and he's paid taxes here. And I remember walking out with them and they thanked me for fighting for him. And it like still gets to me to this day because, you know, I wasn't able to do anything. I mean, I fought everything with everything I had, but I couldn't do anything to keep his family together. But had Cy Vance not charged him with a crime, he would still be here and with his family to this day. And this was someone who had no criminal record, who was a tax-paying member of our community, and instead, you know, was forced to, you know, be forcibly removed from this country. And so I think that we need to stand up for Asians and Asian Americans, citizens, permanent residents, and folks who may be undocumented. And that is what I've always done as a public defender and what I will continue to do as district attorney. So thanks so much for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Eliza. It was a pleasure speaking with you and learning more about your platform. And thank you for taking time to join our candidates forum.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
We're at 9:15. Liz, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in our candidates forum tonight.
Sure.
It's a privilege to have you be a part of the program. I'd like to first introduce, before we get to our questions, Yang Chen, who is our Executive Director, Executive Director of Albany.
Good evening, Ms. Karate. My name is Yang Chen. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Bar Association of New York. We call ourselves Albany for short. And we were founded in 1989 to represent the interests of Asian American and Pacific Islander legal professionals and the community that we serve. And currently we're at about 1,500 members, active paid members, making us the largest diverse bar association in New York. And we believe it makes us the largest diverse bar association in the country. We are certainly the largest affiliate of NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, out of some 90 affiliates across the US, representing the interests of some 60,000 attorneys of Asian American and Pacific Islander descent. And we're very glad to have you here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come in front of you guys.
Great. Thanks, Yang, and thanks, Liz. So Liz, just so you're aware, we'll be speaking for about 30 minutes tonight. I'll reserve a few minutes in the beginning and at the end for your introductory and concluding remarks. And then over the course of today's conversation, a few of my colleagues from the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force will take turns posing questions. And then I'll field 1 or 2 questions from the audience, time permitting. So Liz,
Sure.
would you like to take a minute or two for introductory remarks?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I see my old friend Tristan Lowenz on tonight. We had a case together back when I started my practice. So Tristan, good to see you. Yeah, I call myself the practitioner in this race. What that means is, you know, I've been working in 100 Center Street for the past 21 years. I started my career as a district attorney. I was an ADA for 6 years. I was in the trial division for 4 years. And then I was in the investigative division for 2 years, where I went and worked on the oil for food case, which was a case that had was investigating Saddam Hussein and his ways around the sanction programs developed by the UN. I left when I left the Manhattan DA's office, I went and worked at a firm for 2 years where I worked on the 9/11 terror funding litigation and suing state-sponsored of terrorism under the 9/11 Anti-Terrorism Act. And then 12 and a half years ago, I started my own practice, and I've been doing mostly criminal. Actually, Tristan and the case we had was one of the few civil cases I've done in my private practice. I do much more criminal work. I work in criminal court, Supreme Court, federal court, family court, do some asset forfeiture, anything that's tied to criminal cases. That's just what I do. I do everything from white collar to blue collar to gray collar. And that's really why I'm running, because I really have a vision for the office. Imagine if you had someone leading the office who knew what it was like to work on every side of the courtroom, knew what it was like to be a DA, and really have a vision for this office. And the vision of this office is leading an office. I owe my whole career to being at the Manhattan DA's office. And the fact that it taught me how to be a thoughtful, objective, independently thinking lawyer. And I see a little bit of a vacuum in that when I go up against the DA's office for the past 12 and a half years. So that's really why I'm running. That's my vision for the office. And I look forward to the questions tonight. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. It's great to hear some of your motivations for running and your vision. And we look forward to our conversation and hearing more about it. I'd like to introduce first Karen Yao. Karen Yao is an Albany board member, and she'll ask the first question. Karen?
Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am, as Tai Yi said, a board director for Albany. I'm also a civil rights lawyer. And tonight I want to ask you about how you will be developing talent in your office. Asians constitute about 14% of New York City's population and more than 10% of Manhattanites. And yet, Asian Americans constitute a much smaller proportionally number of ADAs in the Manhattan DA's office, and almost none in the top leadership positions. So will you have Asian Americans in leadership positions under your administration?
Yeah, I think there is a cultural fluency that the district attorney's office has to speak in every aspect of New York. I believe there's about over 160 different cultures in New York. Obviously, the Asian American community is very highly represented here in Manhattan, and ironically close to 100 Center Street. It's in literally the backyard. So I think that there's definitely a cultural fluency that needs to be in every aspect of this office. I think we have to really recruit, David Dinkins, who was the person who dubbed New York the Great Mosaic. And I think that every city agency, every district attorney's office should be representative of that great mosaic, because I think the more cultural fluency we have in looking at cases, looking at how cases are done, how they're prosecuted, what's going on in specific communities is key to that. So I think we definitely have to have very large representation for the people who we see a lot of these cases as victims. So you can't relate to victims if you can't relate to people culturally. I understand that firsthand as having done both sides of the courtroom. And I think a diversity in race, religion, gender, sexuality has to be, not only in the office, it has to be representative at the higher echelons.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that response. So how will you ensure that? How will you ensure that kind of diversity that reflects the beautiful mosaic that is New York City?
I mean, it all comes down to recruiting. It comes down to recruiting. I think you have to recruit from the local law schools, I think, as well as nationally. But I think really, there's a huge amount of talent here in New York City. And I think we should try and hire people who know within. I mean, I know when I went for my interview and they said, why do you think you'd be good at this job? I said, well, because I understand what it's like to live here. And I think that is really representative of the office and how you prosecute cases and understand what's going on. And I don't think that that's specific to me as like a white Irish Catholic woman. I think that that's responsive to, the community at large that we serve. And I think that, we have to recruit from all law schools, and we have to give an eye to making sure that in our recruitment process that everybody is represented. And if we can't find it naturally where people don't want to come and work with us, that we have to look out, outside, a little bit outside of the box to try and find that talent.
Got it. Now, a follow-up question to that is Manhattan DA's office, unlike some of the other DA's offices, right now doesn't have an independent unit of ADAs and investigators whose work focuses solely on hate crimes and hate motivated incidences. Under your administration, would you develop one?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a lot of how the office works. So in domestic violence, sex crimes, hate crimes, they are units within the office. And what that means is that there's lawyers who work in those units, but they don't work only on hate crimes. They don't work only on domestic violence crimes, and they don't work only on sex crimes. They do a variance of other things. And I think we have to look at that. And I think it's like I would definitely be interested in that. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm definitely going to do it, because I just think that you have to look at the numbers, but I do think you have to have a very strong hate crimes unit. I know that the hate crimes unit actually does have its own investigative unit. And I think that already exists. It's just, recently hate crimes has gone up in the past 2 years in a way that it hasn't gone up before. So I think the cases of hate crimes were statistically low in numbers. I think there was 23 in 2019, and in 2020, I think there was 24. Those kind of numbers don't dictate its own bureau. But if we see that rise in crime, I think that yes, we have to really consider whether or not a bureau is an appropriate response to all of these things.
Right. My understanding, and we have a colleague gonna talk to you quite a lot about hate crimes and battling hate crimes later. But my understanding is that the general trend has been trending down in terms of hate crimes, but the upsurge in the Asian American community is about 800%.
Yes. But that the base number was, I think, in 2019, 24 cases. So I mean, that's the base. Yeah, no, but
and as of right now, my understanding is we have about, I think, 47 incidences reported already to NYPD.
Well,
So
I mean, I don't mean to minimize it too.
Mhm.
I think that I'm not trying to minimize it. I'm just trying to talk it from an office perspective of how you lead an office. But I'm not trying to minimize, and one hate crime is really one too many, whether it be anti-Asian, anti-Semitic, you name it, it's bad. So you can't have that. And I do think we have to look towards having a bureau towards it. I just, it's sometimes, it's funny because when you come to these things, sometimes you come to this and they're saying, well, aren't you going to shrink the footprint of the district attorney's office? And like, it becomes a question of resources. But yes, I do think that we have to be responsive to the communities and responsive to the communities that we serve. And it's especially responsive to the victims who are there. So if we see this uptick in crime, it's really the correct response to have its own bureau.
So Liz, I want to just take a little detour. You have mentioned already that 100 Center Street is right next to Manhattan's Chinatown. Well, the mayor has announced and planned to close Rikers and replace it with 4 borough-based or locally based jails. And in Chinatown, the plan is to build a skyscraper jail.
I've seen the plans. The plan.
So first of all, do you support it? And second, how will you ensure that low-income and elderly Asian American immigrants in Chinatown will not be disproportionately affected by it?
Well, I don't know that the district attorney's office has a say in whether or not that building goes forward. But as a constituent and as a New Yorker, I've seen the plans for it, and it's horrible. It doesn't really make any sense, and especially since there is an old age home right on the corner that would be in the shadow of that building, and that building is a mammoth. So I don't think it's the appropriate response to build that building. I mean, it's funny when they talk about it. I think the closing of Rikers was optimistic. It was based on a jail number of 3,300 people, and I think that we have not seen that. I think the jail population got down to 3,300 in April of last year in the height of the pandemic. But ever since then, it's gone up, and there's about 5,400 people who are currently in Rikers, and crime's going up. So I just don't think that the mandate for the 3,300 people to close Rikers is going to match I just don't think the numbers are going to make it possible. Also, too, this is an $8 billion project. And I just don't know, when people are calling to defund the police, something I do not think is a good idea. I don't understand why they're not looking at if we're going to build a mammoth building that makes no sense in relationship to the neighborhood of where it comes, the numbers don't support it actually fulfilling all the needs, and it's an $8 billion project, it doesn't seem to make sense.
Okay, so Liz, I'm hearing from you, you do not support it.
No, I mean, as a constituent, but as a DA, I don't know that I have a lot, to say. And I know that they've lost the first round of appeals on that case. But I just think that the numbers don't support closing Rikers.
Well, it's a very, Manhattan DA's office is a very important office. If for nothing else, if you're elected, you have a very powerful bully pulpit.
Yeah, no. And as a bully pulpit, I don't think it makes much sense to build that behemoth building. And honestly, when I saw the pictures of it, I was kind of like, and the renderings, my jaw dropped. I was like, oh my God, how are they going to I mean, it's so out of scale with the neighborhood, that it's just, it doesn't make sense. I'm not an urban planner, but it doesn't make sense to me.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for your very candid and thoughtful response. Taiyi?
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Liz. I'll hand over the virtual microphone now to Karen King. Karen King is a co-chair of our Pro Bono and Community Service Committee at Albany.
Hi, Liz. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
To meet you, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. My question is a little bit about a particular prosecution that kind of lives in the memory of Asian Americans, and it's the prosecution of Abacus Bank during the financial crisis, where it really seemed like a local community bank servicing Chinatown was being targeted and scapegoated when the big banks on Wall Street were kind of let to run their way. And wanted to get your thoughts on that particular case, but also given the US-China political dynamic right now and the effects it's already had on the streets in terms of the rise of anti-Asian hate, what measures would you take to ensure that Asian businesses and individuals aren't targeted and unfairly prosecuted, just given the political environment?
Right. Well, I think it kind of goes back to Karen's Yao's original question of diversity and a cultural fluidity. My understanding is Abacus Bank is a community bank that makes loans to immigrants who do not have the same kind of backing and same financials as people who have been, I remember when I got a mortgage for my apartment and I thought that they wanted a kidney, and I'm a lawyer and I had it all right there. So I was kind of like, and so I can't imagine someone who's trying to make ends meet and, who doesn't have a business acumen and documents. And, I think that that's what the great thing about community banks are, is they say, I know you're a hardworking person and I know you work here and I'm going to make this loan. Unfortunately, it was caught up in the 2008 collateral loans. I actually worked a little bit on a class action about mortgage fraud. So I know a little bit about it, the mortgage fraud crisis that took in 2008. And it seems like, the district attorney's office was trying to make a name for itself in really the wrong place. And then to kind of add insult into injury that they tried it 3 times, which is ridiculous. I do know Chantarelle Sung. We briefly overlapped in the office. And I watched the documentary and I can't believe they tried it 3 times. And then I couldn't actually believe that they went on videotape to discuss it. I was kind of like, it's crazy. I was like, and try and defend their actions, because I think that that's exactly what we're talking about, the cultural diversity in the office is going at right away. And so that someone who is in a higher up position and who does make prosecutorial, higher up prosecutorial decisions say, you have this all wrong. This is how the banking works in this part of town with this certain clientele. And I think that that's my take on the Abacus Bank.
Thanks. Taiyi, I'll turn it back because I know there are lots of topics and questions to cover.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Liz. Liz, the next kind of series of questions addresses an issue that is obviously of tremendous importance to the Asian American community, and that's the upsurge in violence against, and the rise in instances of anti-Asian violence in our city. To kick things off, I'd like to hand it over to Yang Chen, who I believe has a question to get us started.
Thanks, Ty. And actually, this is a follow-on from the question that Karen Yao had asked about whether Liz it would be open to having a dedicated hate crimes unit. And so we threw some numbers out, but I actually had ability to pull up some of the numbers myself before I posed the question. So the 800% number that Karen Yao referred to, it comes from a fact sheet produced by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. And I believe it's from California State University, Santa Barbara. So the number is derived from 3 anti-Asian crimes reported in 2019 versus 28 in 2020. So that's how they got the number 833%. And the fact sheet also shows that in contrast, the percent of change in total hate crimes in New York City from 2019 to 2020 was a decline of 38%. And this fact sheet also shows an overall hate crime drop across the country of 6% in 2020, while the national average is 145%. So New York, in contrast to the national average, is quite stark with a negative 30% versus an 833% increase. So that's one set of numbers that we have. And then independent of that, Albany, through its Anti-Asian Violence Task Force, we've actually combed through the news reports from the beginning of this year. And we compiled the number of news reports of attacks against Asians in New York. And we've collected over 100 reported incidents in the news reports in the press since the beginning of this year. 61 of those are in Manhattan. And of those 61, 21 have been referred to the Manhattan DA's office for prosecution. So in light of those numbers, would you support a dedicated unit to investigate and prosecute hate crimes in the Manhattan DA's office?
Yeah, I'm going to stick to my original answer. I'd be open to it if the numbers go on. You're talking to someone who was in the office. And when I was in the office, I had 150 misdemeanors at one time. So there's an efficiency to the office that we have to maintain in cases. I think what has changed and why I'm very much open to it is because crime has gone down, the quality of life crimes they're not doing, they're diverting as much. And so it does leave more space to investigate the cases. And I do think that, when you have a bureau versus a unit, you really have to investigate these cases. And I do think that that's why I'm open to it, because it really has to have investigation and a really thorough investigation as to what's going on. Sometimes, in hate crime, you have to have some sort of intent to make it a hate crime, because all crimes are crimes, and then hate crimes make them bump ups to the charges. So there really is a specific intent to the crime, and sometimes it's not just made out by language. Sometimes it's made out by actions. Sometimes it's made out by prior records. Sometimes it's made out by what we see on social media. And I think that what we have to also do too is really be working with the police and how we report hate crimes. And I think reporting of hate crimes and making sure that crimes are getting reported the right way, because I think that that's one of the other problems that exists in not only the uptick in hate crimes, but in whether or not NYPD declares it a hate crime or not. So these are all the things that I would be definitely open to, especially if it trends in that direction, to a bureau.
Okay, so Ty, I'll pass it on back to you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Liz. Next, we have Jen Luo, who is a member of our issues committee. Jen, the stage is all yours.
Thank you. And then thank you again for providing those numbers. I was actually about to say those corrections myself, because I think earlier I had said 59 cases, even though the actual number is 61. And I think I may have also said that it's 61 that were referred to the DA's office, when I think actually it's 21. So I do apologize to the viewers if there's some misrepresentation about that. So, and now turning back to you, Liz. So I think you had answered in a prior question with the New York Jewish Agenda about how you would prosecute hate crimes by saying that you view hate crimes as two fundamentally different types of hate crimes. One type is done by a lone wolf, and then the other type is motivated by, it's perhaps related to mental illness. And so I'm wondering what are your approaches to dealing with these two types, and how do you classify when one is one type or the other, right? Because a lot of times these two types overlap, right? People with mental illness are capable of doing things with intent. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, the clarification kind of comes when you have, and that's where it comes down to investigation, where you have somebody who really plans out an attack, who goes into a synagogue and kills 5 people, who goes into somewhere, and these are the mass attacks that we have seen that are planned out, and they are because of hate. And that comes down to the investigation. It doesn't mean that mental illness is not involved, but somebody who has enough hate in them to then go out and systemically plan an attack against people because of what their race, religion, sexuality. That's what I meant by a lone wolf. Who does that. And then you have people who, what we're seeing a lot of hate crimes is, especially is that people who have mental illness. I've had a lot of sit downs with the Manhattan Institute, who is, a group that is dedicated to statistics like this. And that's really where the source of the information comes from, where we can really see, people who there is an overlap of people with mental illness issues and who do something on the street, or they hit someone and they say something derogatory about that person, or it is a hate crimes motivated thing that also goes with mental illness. So that's what I meant when I was talking about that.
So just to clarify, when you're dealing with people who commit a hate crime or who commit any type of anti-Asian violence, who also happen to have mental illness, what is your approach?
I mean, I always say it's on a case by case basis, and I think we have to look at it. And I think we have to look at what is the crime charge, what is the intent behind that crime, what is the level of crime charge, and what is the level of mental illness of the defendant as well. I mean, I think we have to look at it in a way where, sometimes jail is appropriate, and sometimes holding people fully accountable, because mental illness is not always an excuse for every type of crime that we see. And then we also have to look at, what is going on with this person, what has happened before. And so it's really a case by case basis. I also think restorative justice sometimes can be appropriately used in these cases, but I think it is incumbent upon first the defendant understanding what has happened, understanding that they did is wrong, and willing to admit their wrongdoing, and then making sure the victim is in the right place for restorative justice and is amenable and open to using this as a teaching moment. I think we really need to listen to victims and listen to what victims are going through and what they see as themselves getting what they see themselves as getting justice, because sometimes I know firsthand victims feel victimized by the system all over again. And I don't think I think that's something we have to really help stop and root out as the DA. But it really comes down to a case by case basis. But I think when you're looking at the case by case basis and looking at the facts of each and every case, there's a myriad of things that you can do.
Well, thank you for recognizing that there's another form of trauma, right? When the legal system doesn't recognize your existing trauma. I think that's a very important point. So it sounds like if you're looking at it on a case by case basis, right? If you're going to be the DA, right, you're going to have thousands of cases. You can't obviously look at them all by yourself, case by case. You're going to have like deputies and people under you who are reviewing them. So at some point, I'm sure, and this is where like management becomes important. How what do you envision in terms of training and in terms of management and training people to identify these type of hate crimes?
Right. Well, I think that the thing is it is a management job. And I think that you have to, as I said in the beginning in my opening remarks, as having been a district attorney there, I understand firsthand, I was taught and trained, to think critically, fully investigate my cases, and look, very objectively at what the facts are and how those facts interact with the victim, how they interact with the defendant, and how they interact with the community at large. That's the kind of training that I got. And basically it served me quite well because I've gone out to have a very successful career for the past 14 years since leaving the office. And I think that that's really what this job is there's a lot of young lawyers who come straight out of law school, traditionally to the district attorney's office. And we need to be training lawyers how to think thoughtfully, critically, fully investigate their cases. I think that we also have to, part of the mandate of the district attorney's office is that you have to have social workers there and social workers who can really work with victims and, having trauma-informed techniques, going out into the neighborhood and talking to community groups and understanding what the community is feeling, and also having an avenue where people can come to the district attorney's office to report the crimes that are happening, because not everyone feels comfortable going to the police. And I think that this happens not only with management from the top, but it also happens in a way where, the management from the top, what I would be doing as a district attorney is you have to have routine meetings with all of your unit heads and your bureau chiefs, so you can really monitor what's happening. And you also have to have routine meetings with the investigations unit and with the NYPD and the hate crimes task force and say, how many cases do we have this week? What is going on with this case? Why haven't we been able to fully prosecute these cases, and really get it down to like a management style? So what you would do as a district attorney is you would have a macro level where you would be having routine meetings with your units and with your bureaus, so that you would have, you would know generally what the numbers are, what kinds of cases they are, where we're having problems prosecuting cases, and what the tenor of these cases are. And that's what the district attorney does. And that's how the management works.
That's a very detailed answer, and thank you. Although I'm pretty sure that's what the current DA is already doing, right? And so it's not that different from the status quo. But let's maybe it would be more helpful if we have more specific examples. So let's say the Brandon Elliott incident happened when you're in the DA. Something very similar happens, right? We have a man who kicks someone outside of the office building, and this man has mental illness, a history of felonies, violent felonies, and is living in homeless shelters. What would you do with this defendant? And how about that example of another defendant who had separately attacked 3 different Asian people, right? Each time after post-arraignment release. What would you do in that instance?
One of the things I've been very vocal about is that I think that all hate crimes should be bail eligible. So I would first, as a district attorney, work use the district attorney's office as a bully pulpit to say that all hate crimes are bail eligible. So that means that everybody who gets in front of a judge, everyone who gets arrested for a hate crime does not get a death appearance ticket, but goes through the system and sees a judge. And the judge can make a necessary determination about what should be going on and what we need to be doing in this case. And I think that starts with bail. It starts at the top. It starts at what you're charging and how you're charging it. The other problem that people don't realize sometimes is the courts are closed. So when people are getting arrested, they're getting desk appearance tickets and they're not coming back to court for 2 months because, and this is a big problem. The courts have to open. And I think that this is a unique problem of the courts right now because of the pandemic. And so I think we have to look at these cases on an individual basis. And I think that, yes, but that's, you say it's status quo, but I'm going to push back a little bit because, we have the 4 corners of the law to deal with, so the law hasn't changed. So I think we have to be able to look at cases and act within our mandate, which is what the law is, and make sure that people, and I think that starts with a big change from the current DA of saying that all hate crimes should be bail eligible. And I also think that if minimally they should not be getting desk appearance tickets on a hate crime. And so that's where I would start. And then it's like, how do we charge the case, properly investigate it, and then see what's right and talk to the victim, understand where the victim is coming from, and understanding where the victim is going to see justice.
Well, so thank you, but I want to focus on what's within your current control, right? If you're the DA, let's putting aside the lobbying on bail control, on bail question. I just want to know what your charging decision would be if the Brendan Elliott incident happens again or something similar like that happens.
I'm sorry, but I don't know what the Brendan Elliott yet. Can you remind me about the facts?
Yeah,
It's
absolutely. No
9:30.
worries. Like, nobody remembers somebody's specific name, right? So that's totally understandable. So this is the one, but I'm sure you know this because this is the one that was a video taken of a woman being stomped on outside of an office building in Midtown.
Oh, yeah, it says, oh,
Right, and there were a bunch of people.
Miss Villar, yes.
Exactly, and there were a
Yeah.
bunch of people in the lobby and help her.
I just want to know that I remember the victim's name, not the defendant.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, I think that case is, I think that you should look at that case, and I think that they charged an assault. I think that case should have been made out to be an assault too. I think that was, I think you have, when you crush somebody's pelvis, that could be an argument for a serious physical injury, which was an assault too. I think we also have to look at, where what those two doormen did. I think what those two doormen did by not helping her is really, I think it's beyond tragic, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think that we have to really look at, people's culpability in all of this and saying, you do have a responsibility to see these things. And if you do see it, you can't close your door on someone and call the police. So I think that I would have looked at some criminal liability for the people who turned away from her as well. And I think you could have really charged an assault too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Liz. Liz, we've already kept you past the scheduled time that we told you we would reserve for tonight. We appreciate that it's late in the evening, and we appreciate you participating in tonight's forum. At this point, I think that given kind of our limitations on time, I'd like to just offer a few minutes for you to offer any concluding remarks that you might have.
I mean, if people have more questions, I'm always happy to answer them. I mean, I'm happy to get off too, but I'm happy to stay on and answer questions.
We'd love to keep the conversation going. And so I guess if that's kind of the spirit of how everyone's feeling right now, I will ask our audience members to see if you have any questions, please do plug them into the chat box. And I believe Karen Yao has one final question that has been posed to other candidates in the past and it's been coming up time and time again. So Karen, over to you.
Yeah. Although I have been a workers' rights lawyer for a long time, I actually didn't come up with this question, I'm ashamed to say, but it's a very, very good one. And so I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to consider it. Wage theft is a huge problem among immigrant workers, both documented and undocumented workers. What is your approach in prosecuting or not prosecuting these non-payment of wage cases, or what I would call wage theft cases?
Yeah, I mean, there's two different types of wage theft right now. There's wage theft where you're not paid at all, and then there's wage theft where you're not paid the appropriate charges. And some of those are in the federal jurisdiction, especially when it's ERISA or labor union, and some of that is in the state realm. I think that, out of this race, I think there's several things that are going to happen at the next DA's, in the next generation of the DA's office, no matter what happens. I think there's going to be a conviction integrity review unit that is very robust and not staffed by someone from within the office. I think there's going to be a new sex crimes and domestic violence bureau, which may or may not include hate crimes, which is it might be a natural progression of where that is going. And third, I do think that there has to be a wage theft bureau that looks at these cases and that really looks at the criminality. There is a civil component to all of this, and which is why the Attorney General's office does a lot of those cases. But when there has to be some sort of flow between the Attorney General's office and the District Attorney's office, so that when there is a criminal case, that the District Attorney's office can do it. Traditionally, the Attorney General is who does the criminal prosecutions of these cases as well as the civil prosecution. But I do think that there needs to be there needs to be a wage theft unit, because I think the wage theft is really probably a bigger indication of other kinds of fraud that is happening. And I think that wage theft is really kind of just the whistleblowing to what is really going on in the industries that are typical of wage theft. And I think that that's where we need to be putting our time and attention, because I think that the investigative unit of the district attorney's office has to become a vibrant unit that serves all the communities. And I think that wage theft is one of those things where you can really, it's conduit to a lot more bad behavior, criminal behavior.
Yeah, your point about it being really the tip of the iceberg of more criminal and fraudulent activity is actually our philosophy too. When I was at the Labor Bureau at the New York State Attorney General's office,
Yeah.
these were the cases that we did. And my understanding is that the Manhattan DA's office has been working with the New York State Attorney General's office, but the current DA's prosecution of wage theft is primarily centered on construction cases. So what's your thought about that?
Well, I think it's construction fraud is usually the biggest purveyor, but I think we also see it in the restaurant industry. I think also too, there's a little bit of a problem too with sometimes you see it in a lot of unions, and then you have a lot of ERISA cases. I've actually defended an ERISA case in the Eastern District, and I've done a couple of these. So I think some of them just depends on the statute, goes more federal than state. But I think that we have to look at all industries that do this. But I think the restaurant industry is another bad offender of wage theft as well.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that response.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Liz. We're approaching the end of our time, and so just to be sensitive of our time constraints, Liz, do you have concluding remarks that you'd like to conclude this segment with?
Well, I mean, I think you're one of my last Zooms. Election day is Tuesday. So, you know, we're wrapping it up with you guys. So, you know, it's the first time candidate, I think, for all of us, except minus Dan Court. So, you know, it's really been interesting and an eye opener to be a candidate. I've really enjoyed it. And I think, you know, we're all running because we love, I'm running because New York's my home and I love New York. I come from a family of public servants, and I just think this is the best way that I can serve my city. So I'm thank you for your time and interest in my campaign. You can go to my website, you know, at lizcrotty2021.com. And remember to vote. It's a really important election. I don't know how many of you guys are Manhattan residents, but for New York City, it's a big election, and I think we really are at a pivotal time. I hope I would have your support, but even if I don't, I think I really encourage everyone to vote, because I really think we all have to get out there and we really have to, you know, have our voices heard. And I mean that now more as a candidate than I ever did as a constituent before. And I really appreciate your time and attention, and thanks so much for having me tonight.
Thanks so much, Liz, for the instructive and engaging conversation. It was a pleasure having you be a part of the Candidates Forum.
Okay, thank you so much. Talk to you guys.
Thank you, Liz.
Bye-bye. Next
Bye.
time, you know, the election's over, so.
Thank you.
See you guys later.
See ya.
Bye.
Good night.